Very good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. You're watching the live desk, live from the Iraq inquiry, where the former Prime Minister Tony Blair has been given evidence today. He had one question to answer about the war, and that was why. He talked about 9/11. He told us that 9/11 changed everything as far as the world was concerned and its reaction to Iraq. And he also said that weapons of mass destruction was the main reason for going to war and not regime change.
Up to September the 11th, we thought he was a risk, but we thought it was worth trying to contain it. The crucial thing after September the 11th is that the calculus of risk changed. The Americans, in a sense, were saying, we're for regime change because we don't trust he's ever going to give up his WMD ambitions. We were saying we have to deal with his WMD ambitions. If that means regime change, so be it. The assessed intelligence has established beyond doubt is that Saddam has continued to produce chemical and biological weapons. I did believe it. I mean, that was the... And I did believe it, frankly, beyond doubt. And
beyond your doubt, but beyond anybody's doubt?
OK, let me just explain the bullhole that you can hear in the background. The Stop the War Coalition, along with many other people who want to demonstrate about the war in Iraq, are holding a demonstration outside the Chilcot Inquiry today. They had hoped to see the former Prime Minister, but he went in through a back door around about 7:30 this morning. Nevertheless, they've not been put off by the weather, and they're hoping that perhaps they'll be able to see the former Prime Minister, Tony Blairs, as he leaves this evening. Unlikely, but there you go. Meantime, lots of other people are filing in now to the Chilcot Inquiry to witness proceedings firsthand. They're likely to start again around about 2 o'clock. There are 60 people that can sit in the public area of the inquiry meeting room itself. 20 of those seats are for family members. That's been decided by a ballot. The others are members of the public. Hopefully you can hear me over that bullhorn, hopefully. Let's take you, though, in the meantime, to hear from Joey Jones. And Joey, I know you've been monitoring events for us throughout the day, throughout the morning this morning. What particularly has caught your eye?
Well, I think what is plain is that Tony Blair has not had it all his own way this morning. It started from the very opening of the proceedings when, of course, he came in, sat down, but then had to listen, first of all, to some detailed opening remarks from Sir John Chilcot, and then an interminable initial question from Sir Roderick Lyne before he even got a word in. And it continued during that last session when Lawrence Freedman, the historian, gave what, certainly in my experience, was his best and most detailed performance as an interrogator in looking at the dossier and the way in which the case for war was actually presented. For example, we know that Tony Blair has been doing a massive amount of research on all this. There was one point when he went through the detailed notes that he's obviously got with him to try and justify his case as to why the 45 minutes claim has been blown up out of proportion retrospectively.
Between September 2002 and the end of May 2003, there were 40,000 written parliamentary questions on Iraq. It was mentioned twice. There were 5,000 oral questions. It was not mentioned at all. In the 18th of March, nobody mentions it.
I can think of a speech by Jack Straw in February where he does mention it.
So Lawrence Freedman straight back at the Prime Minister. They're obviously showing him that, well, Tony Blair may know a lot about the documents, but he does not have perhaps as detailed command of them as those people who've been doing the inquiry for all this time. One of the frustrations perhaps for us as journalists about the inquiry is that they tend not to offer follow-up questions. They allow the witness to say what they think and then they move on. But what they do quite often is give us an idea as to the conclusions that they are reaching. And listen to Lawrence Freedman here. Again, this is him discussing the way in which evidence was presented in that key dossier.
It's taken as an indication of how evidence that may be pointed was given even more point in the way that the dossier was written.
Evidence was given even more point. That comes close. It's a scholarly way of saying it was sexed up, if you like, and it does seem that in that respect he is close to those people who have so criticised the dossier. He did also, of course, ask the key question as to why Tony Blair said that the case was beyond doubt. Listen particularly to the way in which Tony Blair justifies this towards the end of his answer.
What I believe the assessed intelligence has established beyond doubt is that Saddam has continued to produce chemical and biological weapons. I did believe it. I mean, that was the... And I did believe it, frankly, beyond doubt. And
beyond your doubt, but beyond anybody's doubt?
Look, if I'd taken, for example, the words out of even the 9th of March 2002, or the March 2002 JIC assessment, it said it was clear that. Now, if I'd said it was clear that in the forward, rather than I believe beyond doubt, it would have had the same impact.
Well, he says it would have had the same impact to say it was clear that, but some people, I think it is a moot point, will suggest that beyond doubt is a stronger formulation. In many respects, actually, I think that Tony Blair was frustrated because the line of questioning kept boxing him in. Every time he tried to make a sort of political speech, if you like, then the questioner would come back at him and say, look, we'll get onto that later. The only point where basically was when Sir John Chilcot offered him a soapbox and he duly took it.
Did you want to make more of that, in fairness to you? I think we've taken the point. It's not in contention.
Well, it's just sometimes, I think, I'll do this very briefly, but sometimes what's important is not to ask the March 2003 question, but to ask the 2010 question. Supposing we had backed off this military action, supposing we'd left Saddam and his sons, who were going to follow him, in charge of Iraq. Now, I think it is at least arguable that he was a threat, and that had we taken that decision to leave him there with the intent, with an oil price not of $25, but of $100 a barrel, he would have had the intent, he would have had the financial means, and we would have lost our nerve.
That was, in essence, the speech that Tony Blair has come here to make at the Chilcot Inquiry. And if we just, I'll carry on talking, but look at with slow motion his response at the end. You can see just the nod of the head, and I think he looks pretty satisfied that he's been given that opportunity, because in general they've been chivying away at him and making it difficult for Tony Blair to make the case in the way that he is accustomed to.
Yeah, certainly looked pretty confident towards the end. That old Blair smile we saw there. Thanks very much indeed for now, Joey. I'll try and talk as best I can over the bullhorn from the Stop the War coalition, who are gathering about 50 metres or so away, hoping to see the former Prime Minister, but have not been successful so far. As we talk to our political editor, Adam Bolton, continue looking at those pictures for you live, as I said, from just outside the QE2 conference centre where the Iraq inquiry is being held. Adam, I wonder if we could talk in a bit more detail about the United Nations and something that Tony Blair said that caught my attention when he said, if we try the UN route and it fails, then we still need to deal with it, the situation, we still need to deal with it. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think a lot of people will concentrate on that. Tony Blair's critics will suggest that it basically shows he was looking for a pretext to war, and that if the United Nations didn't deliver that, then he would have had to find another route, which is what he appeared to say in that interview he tried to dismiss today with Fern Britton last year. Mr. Blair, however, did revisit the same sort of territory later on, and he made it clear that what he was talking about was this whole question of disarming Saddam Hussein of weapons of mass destruction and the capability, the calculus of risk, and that had the United Nations route not dealt with that, then there would have still been a need, and he would argue an urgent need to defend the British population and the population of the world by disarming Saddam Hussein. And really this is the crucial argument that I think there's going to be quite a lot of talk about in the coming days. Mr. Blair repeatedly saying that there isn't what he calls a binary distinction between regime change and dealing with the weapons of mass destruction. We heard earlier Jonathan Powell say, well, had Saddam Hussein been completely disarmed and complied, it would have been a different sort of regime. We've heard Tony Blair at the beginning of this news bulletin, that clip where he says, well, you know, if dealing with weapons of mass destruction meant regime change, so be it. So he's trying to say those people who suggest that really there was a fundamental dishonesty in the case he was making about weapons of mass destruction, and what the Americans wanted to do, which was get rid of Saddam Hussein, they're wrong, that the two were inextricably linked. And it's interesting that repeatedly, Kay, we heard some examples there in Joey Jones's analysis, but repeatedly we have had members of the inquiry expressing a lot of scepticism. For example, we had Baroness Prashar saying, you were discussing the military option, why didn't you simply tell the public that that's what you were doing? We had that famous exchange, I suspect it's going to become, of Laurie Freedman saying, beyond your doubt or beyond anybody's doubt. Laurie Freedman also asking why the focus on Iraq rather than other threats, and also saying, why did you think that you could get through a second resolution in time in the very narrow window which Mr. Blair agreed was there? And then we've had Rod Lyne, who said at one point, as Mr. Blair was saying, well, if Saddam Hussein had been able to rearm, it would have been a threat. And Rod Lyne came back saying, it's these ifs, isn't it? So I think he is being treated with more scepticism by this inquiry than he has certainly in public by any of the previous inquiries, and it's going deeper into his defence of his argument, but basically accepting all the time that there is a case to answer, which of course is not something that necessarily has happened before.
OK, Adam Bolton, for now, thank you. If you're just tuning our way, you're watching the Live Desk live from the Iraq Inquiry here in central London today. More than 3,000 members of the public applied for seats to see Tony Blair give evidence. Only 80 were available for members of the public, though, 40 in the morning session, same in the afternoon. And also families of those who sadly perished in Iraq were also, as part of a ballot, given seats inside. Those that couldn't and wanted to make their views known, as you can see, are either queuing up there now or are demonstrating in the rain outside. Let's speak to John Rentoul. He's a political columnist with The Independent on Sunday. I think it's fair to say that you are a supporter of Mr. Blair, or certainly have been in the past.
On balance.
Certainly have been in the past. Anyway, how do you think he went? How do you think he got on this morning?
Well, I think he played it very calm and low-key. I mean, he didn't want to set off all this criticism of him for being messianic. He didn't want to say, you know, hand on heart, I did what I believe was right, because that sort of thing really upsets the opponents of the war, I think, who don't want to hear how much he believes in himself and how much he believes in his own moral integrity. They just want to hear the arguments, and he went through them in a very methodical and low-key way. It was a rather slow business at times, but he had some interesting answers to some of the questions that the opponents of the war wanted to hear.
He didn't seem to be in any way repentant, though, did he?
Well, no, but why should he be? Because he believes
several 100,000 people died.
Well, several 100,000 may be a bit on the high side. At least 100,000 people have died, which is terrible and very sad. And the occupation has certainly been mishandled and didn't go as well as he had hoped. But he still thinks it was justified. He still thinks it was the right thing to do.
Is he a little bit muddled about whether it was about weapons of mass destruction or regime change?
I don't think so. I mean, the only way you were going to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, or get rid of the threat of weapons of mass destruction, was by changing that regime in the end. So it turned out. I mean, Colonel Gaddafi, he made the point that Colonel Gaddafi in Libya managed to stay in power by renouncing weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps Saddam Hussein could have done that, but he wasn't like that.
Certainly got the impression at the time, all those years ago, that they had gone to great lengths, the British government, to make sure that we didn't feel, the British public, that it was about regime change, it was about weapons of mass destruction, and that we could be in danger within 45 minutes.
No, I think he did deal with that quite well. I mean, the 45 minutes issue became a very serious issue after the war, because the BBC made a very serious allegation that it was invented and put into the dossier by Downing Street for political reasons, which was not true. But at the time, the 45 minutes was not a huge issue. Everybody, I think, understood that Saddam Hussein was a threat to world.
Though, wasn't it, that the Prime Minister wrote, the 45 minutes?
Yes, of course it was, but it wasn't the main...
Does that not mean it was quite important?
Not really, actually. I mean, I think most people understood that Saddam Hussein was a dangerous tyrant. He was a threat to his own people and a threat to regional stability. And ultimately, because he could, his weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists, he could be a threat to us as well.
What did we glean, do you think, about the relationship between Tony Blair and President Bush?
Well, not a lot, to be honest. I mean, Tony Blair never made a secret of the fact that he was going to stand shoulder by shoulder with America and with America's leadership. He made that clear on the day of 9/11, and it was never a secret after that. On that, I don't think he had anything new to say today.
Do you think he's had much new to say today?
Yeah, he had a little bit. I mean, there are some questions about why he said that the threat from Saddam was growing. He had an answer to that. It may not satisfy the opponents of the war, but he certainly had an answer.
The only person that's managed to answer that question so far, I believe Alistair Campbell was asked that as well, wasn't he? But didn't feel that
and wasn't very convincing. Whereas Tony Blair pointed out that he was told about these mobile labs. I mean, intelligence, which again turned out to be wrong. But I mean, that was what he was told, and so that it wasn't unreasonable to say that he thought the threat was growing. He was also asked about the Fern Britton interview. He didn't give a very convincing answer about that because he didn't want to go down that line of reasoning. There's sort of hypothetical questions about what would he have done if he'd known that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. So he gave a few interesting nuances, but these are details on a big picture with which we should be familiar.
OK, we must leave it there, John Rentoul. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the live desk this afternoon. So he was asked in a little bit more detail, the Prime Minister, this morning about what it was that made him decide that war was the only option against Saddam Hussein. And he's basically said when it came down to it, it was a judgment call.
Other countries which were just as opposed to the idea of Saddam having WMD as us, and many of which were much closer to Iraq, clearly didn't agree that military action was needed or justified by the level of threat at that time. So they didn't accept the why Iraq, why now questions, or at least they didn't give two yeses to that. And I'm trying to work out why you did and they didn't.
Well, there's a judgment you have to make. And, you're right in saying if this and if that. But, you see, for me, because of the change after September the 11th, I wasn't prepared to run that risk. I really wasn't prepared to take the risk. Well, that's up to them. But my view, the view of the US, I think the view of many other countries. I mean, after all, when the Iraq action took place, half of the members of the European Union were also with America. Japan was with America. South Korea was with America. But I think there's an interesting point here, because I think you're absolutely right to raise the judgment. And in the end, this is what it is. It's not as I sometimes say to people, this isn't about a lie or a conspiracy or a deceit or a deception. It's a decision. And the decision I had to take was, given Saddam's history, given his use of chemical weapons, given the over 1 million people whose deaths he'd caused, given 10 years of breaking UN resolutions, could we take the risk of this man reconstituting his weapons programs?
So he says at the end of the day it was a judgment call, but was it the right call? Let's debate that in more detail with Andrew Gilligan and also Lance Price, now both political commentators. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the live desk. Andrew Gilligan, to you first of all. We heard from the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister there, saying that there was no attempt at deception. You would say in response?
I think the attempts at deception are fairly clear and fairly documented, and the key one I'd point up, and the inquiry asked quite extensively about this morning, was the claim that the threat from Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was growing. Now, Mr. Blair had two things to say about that. I mean, he was asked, he appeared to agree, actually, that the threat from Iraq had not grown in 2001, 2002 in reality, but that it had grown in his perception, that the perception of Iraq's risk had grown after 9/11. Now, there's two difficulties with that, which is, first, that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and there's no links whatever with al-Qaeda, and that's common ground conceded by all, including Mr. Blair. The second difficulty, of course, is it directly contradicts what he said to Parliament before the war, that Iraq was a growing threat. And he said intelligence proved that as well. There was no intelligence. That's going to be, I think, a difficulty. I think he rather contradicted himself in his evidence this morning.
What would you say to that, Lance Price?
I think the problem that Tony Blair has, particularly in the clip that you've just shown us, is that he was talking about the judgment that he had to make and the decision that he had to make, and how other people, based on perhaps the same evidence, would have come to a different conclusion. Is that personalised it all very much on Tony Blair himself? And of course, the real issue, the issue developed not just about what was going on in Tony Blair's own mind, but how he was then able to use arguments to try to persuade other people, because it wasn't just up to Tony Blair, of course. He had to persuade his cabinet, he had to persuade the House of Commons, he had to persuade Parliament to vote for it. And you then take an extra step from what it was that persuaded Tony Blair to the arguments he was prepared to use to persuade the rest of us. And I think that's the gap that people have a difficulty with and which is still not fully explained.
Andrew Gilligan, I wonder what you make of something that our political editor Adam Bolton picked up on a bit earlier on in the morning when the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, I keep calling him the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister at the time, said that they must try the UN route, and if it failed, then the situation still needed to be dealt with. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, the key charge against Tony Blair is that the decision to go to war was the beginning and not the end of the process, that some sort of agreement was reached with President Bush in April 2002 in the absence of legal support, in the absence of military planning and the absence of factual justification. And all those three things, legal, military planning and intelligence, were subsequently twisted to fit the decision that had been taken already. The inquiry is clearly very interested in that point. Blair disputed it, but at the same time he did say that that he was intended to stand with America come what may, and he said that he wanted to let the UN process work, but of course the problem with that argument is that he didn't give the UN process enough time to work. The inspectors, the weapons inspectors, Hans Blix, said they wanted more time. They had not finished their work at the time Britain and the US decided to invade and preempt their work.
Have they not been given long enough, Lance Price?
It's a judgment that other people have to make, of course. I mean, I would agree with Andrew that the weapons inspectors, and clearly this was Hans Blix's own view, didn't have time enough to carry out their work. But then you have to remember that the troops were building up, they were there, they were ready to go. And this is the difficulty that arises from the fact that the military build-up had its own momentum. That the date was already fixed, almost certainly in George W. Bush's mind. I think we know that, and Tony Blair was clearly aware of that. So the clock was ticking, and although there were the continuing attempts to use the weapons inspectors and to use the United Nations, actually the timetables being set by military hardware and boots on the ground in the theatre.
Andrew Gilligan, the former Prime Minister would have us believe that actually President Bush was being quite gung-ho really about what was happening as far as Iraq was concerned, and that they wanted to invade probably as quickly as possible. He would concur that the UN could get involved, but he didn't really mind one way or the other. And actually it was the former Prime Minister who had insisted on UN involvement. What do you make of that?
Well, I'd point you to what he said to Fern Britton on the BBC last month, which is, I think, a more damaging admission than anything he made this morning, and probably anything he'll make this afternoon, which is that he said essentially he was determined to remove Saddam. He thought Saddam should go even if there hadn't been weapons of mass destruction. So we do know essentially that he was set on regime change from the beginning, and that the weapons of mass destruction were, as suspected, simply a pretext. He said in terms, actually, if we hadn't had weapons of mass destruction, we would have to, quote, use and deploy other arguments. That's the difficulty with the arguments Tony Blair's making. And actually you could see the difficulties he had this morning when he was trying to conflate disarmament and regime change. And he was asked, well, did you give a commitment to President Bush in April 2002 to regime change? And he tried to change the subject to disarmament, but didn't quite answer the question.
We did have...
Price, he didn't...
Well, we did have the very unusual circumstance this morning of Tony Blair admitting that he gets something wrong, because he was trying to draw back from what he said to Fern Britton in that interview. I mean, I agree with Andrew that what he said in that interview on the BBC was very significant, that he would have wanted to remove Saddam Hussein even if he hadn't known that there was weapons of mass destruction. And that was the one moment I thought this morning when Tony Blair really did look uncomfortable, because he tried to say, well, look, I've done loads of these interviews in the past, but it just goes to show that I don't even say exactly what I mean to say when I'm being put on the spot during an interview. And he tried to withdraw the answer, which I don't think, frankly, even as somebody reasonably sympathetic to his position, is credible.
I was going to say, did you believe him?
I think he said what he thought when he was being interviewed by Fern Britton. I think it's perfectly evident from, it came through in the evidence that he gave this morning, And it was public evidence. It was what he had been saying publicly, not just privately, to George W. Bush all the way along, that he thought that it was right that Saddam Hussein should be removed from office. Now, of course, the difficulty he had with that was that regime change, as it's called, isn't a legal justification for going to war, so he had to use other arguments. The mask sort of fell, if you like, during that Fern Britton interview when he said that he would have had to use other arguments, which goes back to the point I was making earlier. There's this distance between what he was convinced of in his own mind and then the arguments that he recognised that he had to use to convince the rest of us. And those arguments weren't necessarily the same ones that had persuaded him.
OK, gentlemen, I think they're probably going to be on their main course, the inquiry now, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your time. Coming up in just a moment here on the live desk, we're going to be talking to the MP who wanted the former Prime Minister impeached. Stay tuned.
Very good morning to you. This is Sunrise on Sky News. Breaking news from a series of explosions have been heard.
Today, mostly dry. It's not too bad at all. Dedicated advice lines for small businesses will also be...
Time now to take a look through the front pages of the morning newspapers.
Live here on Sky News.
The sports headlines, here's Jacqueline.
Portsmouth fans are in need of some good news. World #1 went 3-0 down.
From the Sunrise team, have yourselves a good day. We'll see you bright and early in the morning from 6 o'clock.
At Direct Line, we've been bringing you great deals for 25 years.
To celebrate, we're offering 12 months home insurance at a price of 9.
And free home emergency cover. In 1985, we cut out the middleman to save you money.
Today, we cut out price comparison websites. Loads of money.
So you're never sure of the best deal until you come to us direct.
I love Rubik's Cube, but I can never do the red side.
So for 12 months home insurance for the price of 9, call us now.
Or visit directline.com.
Isn't it funny how family cars really do become part of the family, even though you're the only one who actually looks after it? The least we can do is help you protect it properly. Car insurance from the Cooperative can help you look after your family's pride and joy. Get a quote today on 0800 115 115 and you could even save up to £190 a year. Call us on 0800 115 115 or visit loveyourcar.com.
OK, everyone, memorise the room because we're playing Spot the Difference. Classic game. OK, yes, TV is one of them. Well done. 2 more. Saxophone and golf clubs. Yeah, she didn't even realise he'd bought them. Your belongings can change almost without you noticing. So, Barclays believe it's better to talk your home insurance over with a real person. And it's the same great deal however you get in touch. Hey, look at that! Little cactus. Barclays, take one small step and talk your home insurance through with a real person.
There now follows a gold coin announcement from the London Mint Office. The price of gold has been on an upward trend for many years, and recently it reached a new record price, breaking the coveted $1,000 an ounce barrier. The British sovereign is one of the world's most trusted gold coins, celebrated for its 22-carat purity and its timeless design. And now you may own an original coin minted for Queen Victoria. Usually priced at £339, act now and you may own it at a £200 saving and pay just £139. Payment is not required with your applications, so call now on 0800 859 5122. This Queen Victoria Gold Sovereign was minted in the years 1893 to 1901 and is an original in solid 22-carat gold. Successful applicants will also qualify to view further coins in the collection Sovereign, Era of Gold, Age of Empire, enabling them to own further historic gold sovereigns. These coins will be dispatched on approval and without obligation. To ensure prompt receipt of your application, call now on 0800 859 5122.
Hello again. You're watching the Live Desk live from the Iraq Inquiry here in central London. The former Prime Minister Tony Blair has been giving evidence so far this morning, presently on a lunch break, returning at 2 o'clock. How did he do so far today? Well, unrepentant and silver-tongued. Not my words, but the words of the Plaid Cymru MP who actually wanted the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, impeached. He joins me now live. Adam Price, hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the Live Desk. What did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say this morning?
Well, it is sad, of course. We'll never get an apology from this man for this terrible tragedy. That's the reality of it. And again, I mean, I suppose that you at one level you have to marvel at the power of persuasion, the way that he bats away, deflects the most difficult questions. And it's often, of course, what he leaves out.
What politicians do.
Well, yes, but I mean, what he leaves out, of course, and what he left out of the dossier, the qualifications, etc. You know, that's very, very telling. He talked again about the mobile labs, didn't he, this morning? He referred to them both before and indeed after the war. What he omitted to tell us again today was actually they weren't mobile labs at all, were they? They were air balloons sold to the Iraqis by a British company in 1987. And time and time again, we never get the full picture with Tony Blair.
He says it was a judgment call. At the end of the day, he had to make a judgment. Everything changed after 9/11. He didn't want to leave Saddam Hussein in a position where he could cause significant heartache, deaths here in the West.
Well, yes, now he tells us, of course, when he said that the security services had established beyond doubt that there were WMD programs. What he said is, no, I believe beyond doubt. But it wasn't for him to make that decision, of course. We have a parliamentary democracy.
Yes,
we have a cabinet system of government.
And the House of Commons agreed with him.
Well, they agreed with him because they were given the argument, of course, that it had been established beyond doubt. And, of course,
so had the Prime Minister.
Well, yes, but I mean, none of it was true. I mean, the evidence was completely couched.
He thought it was true.
Yeah, but he thought it was true. Then he presented it in a way that actually removed from us the caveats and all the qualifications, which would meant that any reasonable person would never have come to the conclusion that he arrived at. That's the reality of it. And as a result of that, people died. He admitted today, look, sanctions might have worked. It's possible that sanctions might have worked, he admitted. He didn't say that at the time. He said, well, there's a possibility that if we hadn't had the war, then there would have been a terrible catastrophe. There was a possibility if we hadn't had the war. What was the war? The war was a terrible catastrophe. People did lose their lives. And if he had presented the proper evidence that he'd been presented with, then I don't think Parliament would have made that decision. Parliament would actually have made the same decision the British public had made. They didn't want this war.
Now, you were impeached. Or rather, you wanted, I'll say that again, you wanted the Prime Minister impeached, you weren't impeached.
I was thrown out of the House of Commons for calling him a liar.
What happened?
Well, I said what most people believe. I believe that the Prime Minister misled the House of Commons and the public because he decided he had a fundamental, almost religious certainty that he wanted Saddam removed, and he doctored the evidence, I think, in order to arrive at that. I call him a liar. Because I think that's what happened. We were deceived, and it's absolutely unforgivable. You know, those who lead us should not be allowed to mislead us and get away with it, particularly when we're talking about something as important as peace and war, where people lose their lives. There is a fundamental responsibility on political leaders to be honest when it comes to issues like that, and it didn't happen here. You know what's at stake here in this inquiry? It's democracy that's in the dock. A whole decade of misgovernment, which has left a gaping wound in people's trust in the political process. And that's the important work that this inquiry has to do. It has to heal that scar in the British people's trust in politics.
Let you get in and see what happens in the afternoon session. For now, Adam Price, MP, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the live desk. Thank you. The big question, I suppose, that the Prime Minister has been facing this morning, Tony Blair, was whether the war in Iraq was legal. In response to that, he said, well, we couldn't just sit back and do nothing.
We cannot afford, in my view, and other people may have different views, but in my view, we cannot afford the possibility that nations, particularly nations that are brutal, rogue states, states that take an attitude that is wholly contrary to our way of life, you cannot afford such states to be allowed to develop or proliferate WMD.
Well, Joshua Rosenberg, our legal expert, joins us now live from our central London studio. Hello to you, Joshua. Okay. Was the war legal?
Well, what you just heard Tony Blair saying is not a legal justification for war. It may be a political justification for war, but the message that he was getting across, that we were all at risk from Saddam Hussein, particularly after September the 11th, which, as Tony Blair said, changed everything, that message is not sufficient. And it's quite interesting. Earlier on in his questioning, he was particularly talking about the effect of September the 11th and how the perception of risk changed, even though Saddam Hussein wasn't directly responsible for Al-Qaeda and the attacks on the United States. After the break, mid-morning, Tony Blair moved on to emphasise rather more the strictly speaking, official justification for going to war, which was that Saddam Hussein was in breach of these UN resolutions and he hadn't established that he had disarmed. So during the course of Mr. Blair's evidence, he did support the justification which we heard a couple of days ago from Lord Goldsmith, who was his senior legal advisor. But you got the impression that Mr. Blair was saying this was a risk. I was determined to stop Saddam Hussein. I was looking for a way of doing it. Fortunately, there was a legal way of doing it, and obviously that was one I supported. But the real reason why we went to war, according to Tony Blair, was the risk to us all, not just at the time, but even now in 2010.
But regime change is not a legal justification for war, is it?
You're absolutely right. Regime change is not a legal justification for war, nor is the threat that Tony Blair says that we are at risk from terrorism, and the threat that would have been there if we hadn't taken steps to depose Saddam Hussein. But, as I say, Tony Blair's answer, and I think he's going to be questioned on this more specifically this afternoon, is that there was a legal justification for going to war. It was a legal justification we heard from Lord Goldsmith a couple of days ago. It was that Saddam Hussein was in material breach of UN resolutions. It's quite interesting from a practical point of view that he was saying that Saddam had plenty of opportunity to demonstrate that he had complied with these resolutions. He hadn't, and Tony Blair was absolutely confident that he was right to go to war, and I'm sure that he will say that he was legally justified in doing so. It wasn't regime change, it was failure to comply with binding UN resolutions.
Now, this is not a legal inquiry, though, is it, Joshua? So what could or might happen, do you think, as a result of the inquiry findings?
We're not going to see Tony Blair prosecuted as a result of this inquiry. As you rightly say, this isn't a court, this is simply an inquiry, and we may have more information. I suppose it's theoretically possible that anyone who wanted to take Tony Blair before some court might find more evidence and information as a result of this inquiry, although there's also a great deal that can be said in his defence that's emerged as a result of the evidence he's given and others have given and the papers that have been released. But no, this is not going to make any difference. He is at no greater risk of being prosecuted for war crimes or aggression or anything else today than he was yesterday. He will be at no greater risk at the end of this inquiry. And the fact that nobody has actually taken action against him suggests, I think, that legal action, however much some people would like it, is pretty unlikely.
OK, Joshua Rosenberg, thanks very much indeed for your expertise. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. Well, let's find out what our Foreign Affairs editor Tim Marshall has made of the morning's session. What did you think? How do you think he went?
I think he did what he came to do so far, which was to deflect all the questions away. I noticed during the morning his answers got longer and longer, and that meant there were fewer and fewer questions. The committee were not then following up with backup questions and trying to probe deeper, nor were they interrupting him, which has been a pattern, I think, of the past month of the evidence. And so I think the morning session went by without anything really significant new. What some of the papers tomorrow might hone in on is the idea that he said that the threat was growing and the evidence for it was these mobile labs that they'd found, and that was the intelligence that he was given.
Many of those that have been giving evidence, that are witnesses, had been asked about why the threat was growing. No one else had been able to clarify that.
Yeah, but you see, that's not new, because that was given to the public and to Parliament when that evidence emerged, and from memory, I think Colleen Powell may have referred to it as well, that these labs were running around the country, and then they thought they found one a few weeks after the invasion, but they hadn't, because they didn't exist, of course. But the fact is that he says, first of all, he laid down the foundation of his argument, which is that pre-9/11, that Saddam has to be contained, but the threat of him can be contained. Post 9/11, he laid out his philosophy, his new way of looking at the world, that the idea, the nexus of WMD in the hands of a dictator who may theoretically give it to a terrorist group, that was the game changer, which meant that before war would not be an option to remove Saddam because the threat was containable. Now the threat was so great that war was a possibility.
What's the connection with 9/11 though? Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11.
He had nothing to do with 9/11, nor did Colonel Gaddafi, nor did the North Koreans, nor did the Iranians. But the connection that he makes, and it's an argument you can take or leave, the connection he makes is that once you've gone past 9/11 and you've realised that if they could have killed 300,000 people, they would have done not just 3,000 people in the Twin Towers and the other two planes, that the danger of them getting their hands on WMD is so great that you now have to go to pretty much any lengths to stop anyone that's got it. And the great example in favour of his argument is Libya. Colonel Gaddafi pretty much realised the game was up after the Iraq war and opened his doors and said, yep, you know what, I've got a WMD programme, I've got a nuclear programme. The Pakistani AQ Khan chappie has been selling me all these blueprints. I realise what might happen to me. I now want to disarm completely. And that was the lesson that he learned from 9/11 and Iraq. So Mr. Blair took all that to lay the foundation of his argument, and then went on to say, and the threat was growing, and he backed it up by this evidence you can either call flimsy or the best evidence that was available to him at the time, the mobile labs. Therefore it was growing. I went to Parliament, Parliament backed me up, we went to war. Yes, afterwards we were wrong, but he still doesn't regret it.
Okay, for now, Tim, thanks very much. We'll be hearing from the former Prime Minister again in around about 20 minutes' time. But for now, what difference has there been in Iraq since that war in March of 2003, almost 7 years later now? Let's go across and speak to Kitty Logan. Quite a long delay on the line. But Kitty, how is life different now, would you say?
Very different. Some people you talk to, Kay, say that although Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, that their quality of life now is actually worse than under his governance. People, for example, have a great deal of security fears. We saw that bombing a few days ago, which killed 41 people. They don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have water, electricity, or public services. And there's, of course, that argument that the lack of post-war planning in Iraq has really been conducive to these problems. And there is resentment here, but I think the most of that resentment is weighted towards the Americans. And the fact that Tony Blair is sitting in London today answering questions at an inquiry does very little to solve the problems that the Iraqi people still face here.
But is their life any more peaceful?
Well, you could argue that the security incidents here are fewer, they're further between, and there are less casualties. But if you look at the overall picture, more than 100,000 Iraqis have been killed here since 2003. So maybe, no, it's not more peaceful. We saw 41 people killed just a few days ago. We've got elections looming. People are fearful. There could be further incidents of violence. And as I say, most Iraqi people here feel a great sense of detachment about what's happening in London today, because their lives are certainly not safer. They are resentful towards the 2003 invasion. But to be honest, they've got more to preoccupy them with everyday problems than to be following this inquiry today, because it simply doesn't change anything for them.
OK, Kitty Logan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Quite a lot of the demonstrators here today have been talking about the number of lives lost in Iraq, and quite a few of them waving Iraqi flags. And I think actually we can see some of those for you now. Stop the War Coalition as well, as you can see there. As we look at those pictures, let's speak to Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman. She is a representative for the Kurdistan people in the UK. She is also an Iraqi national. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the live desk. Can I ask you about those protesters to start with and the flags that they were waving? What are we reading into that?
Well, I hope that the demonstrators don't realise what those flags actually symbolise to the people of Iraq, because they're deeply offensive. This particular version of the Iraqi flag is the flag that has the words "God is great" written in Saddam Hussein's own hand. It also carries...
That's in the centre of the flag, isn't it? That was taken, that was removed after he was toppled.
Well, the words "God is great" are still written in the flag, but they're written in a normal Arabic font. And of course, these are the stars the 3 stars also symbolise, have some significance for the Ba'ath Party. So for many of us, and particularly for the Kurds who suffered genocide at the hands of Saddam Hussein's regime, this flag is deeply offensive, and I sincerely hope, and I believe it's just an error or something that the protesters aren't aware of.
How do you feel about the former Prime Minister Fani himself having to give evidence in front of this inquiry today?
Well, it's for the people of Britain to decide whether they need an inquiry or not, and you know, we all admire British democracy. Of course, there are huge debates here in the UK, excuse me, about democracy, the status of democracy right now in Britain, but Britain is a democratic country, and it's to be admired that there is this sort of inquiry into a serious event like a war. I think what's perhaps confusing or puzzling for some of us in Iraq is why Britain doesn't take more credit for what it's achieved and is yet to be achieved in Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein's regime, people were dying, people were conscripted into an army and were forced to fight wars that they had no choice about. Almost 1 million people died in the Iran-Iraq war. Iraq invaded Kuwait. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds and Shia Arabs and Sunni Arabs too were killed in Saddam Hussein's jails and through chemical bombardment.
Absolutely, a shocking state of affairs, certainly, as it is perhaps in Zimbabwe as well. Some people might say as it is in the Yemen, as it is in Somalia and other places around. But regime change is not legally justifiable.
There are many wars that have been conducted in the 20th century that didn't have the cloak of legality, let's say, or the authority of some legal status. But the question is the war just? In my opinion, and I would say in the opinion of many Iraqis, the Iraq liberation, as some of us call it, was indeed just. It doesn't take away the loss that the families of British soldiers will feel, and our hearts go out to them, and I mean that as somebody who has lost people in my own family. It's not something glib that I'm saying. There is nothing that will make up for the loss that those families feel. But was the war just? Yes, it was. The people of Iraq, for the first time ever in our history, we have the opportunity to have democracy. It doesn't mean things are perfect. There are huge problems in Iraq. There were mistakes that were made after the liberation. We have a very long way to go, but we need Britain on our side. We need Britain to help us on that path and to stay on that path.
Okay, ma'am, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Let's take you up to Oxford now and hear from Oliver Miles. He's a former diplomat British diplomat, ambassador to Libya, joins us now live, as you can see. I read an article that you wrote recently in The Independent questioning whether Mr. Blair was a war criminal. What did you conclude?
Well, I didn't conclude anything. I think that that was the headline, which actually I didn't write myself. I'm not complaining about it, but I think it oversimplifies the question. I think the better question is, was there a legal justification for going to the war? And that's, of course, something that's been discussed at great length during the morning session today.
And what do you think?
I don't think there was, no. I think that the legal justification falls down, and after all, we had Jack Straw, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time and himself a lawyer, saying to the inquiry that he didn't accept the advice he was given by his senior legal advisors. He told them that they were being too legalistic. Well, that really won't do.
To what extent does it help now as in examining our entrails 7 years after the war?
Well, I'm not sure that that's the right way to look at it. I mean, today is a big event, obviously. It's a unique event, as some of the commentators have pointed out, that a Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, should be interrogated in this way, and it's not surprising that it's a big, made a big splash in the media and so on. But the inquiry is bigger than that. There are a lot of other questions that need examining. Today we've been hearing, given the opportunity to consider the two very important questions. One is, was the war legal? Another is, did the Prime Minister lie to us? Those are important questions, but they're not by any means the only questions. And I hope that the inquiry will deal with a lot of other important questions. To me, as a former civil servant, one of the most important is, did he misuse the government machine? In other words, did his method of running the country without a cabinet, in effect, get us into this mess? He was saying this morning, and to me the most interesting part of this morning's evidence was that he said that after 9/11, the whole picture changed, and he said that it was necessary after that to look at Iran and Iraq and Al-Qaeda and Libya and A.Q. Khan and even North Korea, I think he threw in at one point, as part of one big picture. I just wonder whether anyone who knew anything about the Middle East gave him that advice. Anyone inside the Foreign Office, anyone outside the Foreign Office. To me, it was oversimplistic, I would say naive.
And perhaps a discussion that he'd had at the Crawford Ranch in Texas?
Well, that's also a very interesting question, which I don't think has been adequately explored yet. And don't forget, the inquiry isn't only based on the oral evidence. They've got the documents as well, which we haven't seen. But I think a very important question is, did Tony Blair simply go along with what George Bush wanted, or did he really try to represent Britain's interests in this question? There was an interesting interview published recently. Colin Powell, who was then the American Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister, who said that he and Jack Straw often agreed to try and get Tony Blair to rein George Bush back a bit. But Tony Blair never actually did it. He said he was going to do it, and then somehow words failed him when he got into the White House. Very strange phenomenon. But did he really try to exercise influence on George Bush, or did he just go along with him?
Well, Mr. Miles, we're just going to have to leave it there. We're almost at 2 o'clock again now, and I'm sure that the former Prime Minister will be taking his seat back in the inquiry very shortly indeed. For now, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Afternoon Live. Just time to squeeze in John Campner, former New Statesman editor, joins us now live from our Westminster studio. How do you think it's gone so far this morning, John?
It's been quintessential Tony Blair, really. One could almost feel nostalgic. I say that with a certain amount of irony. You don't ever, I think people are always barking up the wrong tree when they use the L word. Did he lie or did he not lie? What Tony Blair does consistently, whether it was on Iraq or pretty much any issue, was he created his own truths. And we saw several examples of those today. He said there's no binary connection, apparently, between regime change, the removal of someone, which has been off-stated is illegal under UN and international law, and weapons of mass destruction. So in other words, he was saying this is a false distinction, which can't imagine a single lawyer agreeing with. And he also redefined the question of Saddam's possession of WMD. He said the issue wasn't did he actually have them, which we know he ultimately didn't, but could he possibly possess them? I think he used the term intellectual capital. So once again, rewriting the rules as he goes along in order to cut the right impression.
He looked very tense and nervous when he first entered the chamber earlier on today. Perhaps not with any justification. He seemed to acquit himself quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I think he just feels a little bit affronted. How dare people have the temerity to really challenge him, because he deals on, as Oliver Miles put it, on pretty simplistic terms. That was the Tony Blair deal. George Bush, good man; Saddam Hussein, bad man. The top priority of British foreign policy is to stick as closely as possible to the United States. He pretty much admitted that. He said this wasn't a contract. This effectively was simply a friendship. Again, you don't need to say that he actively and covertly struck a deal for military action with Bush at Crawford in April 2002. I was writing pretty much straight after the war that what happened at Crawford was that Tony Blair said to George Bush, "George, my buddy, I'll be with you come what may," shoulder to shoulder. As soon as you do that, you give away your entire bargaining chips, you give away your national interest. Bush was committed to removing Saddam Hussein, so in any process of logic, so must Britain have ultimately committed itself to military action. And from that point, we were just like a fighter jet, locked onto a radar screen. But sadly, I don't think so far this morning, there's been some thorough questioning from the inquiry team, but it hasn't been incisive. Some of these inconsistencies and some of the, as I call it, this creative logic of Tony Blair hasn't been picked up.
OK, John Campner, thanks very much indeed for your views. Appreciate it. Thank you. You've been watching the Live Desk live from the Chilcot Inquiry, aka the Iraq Inquiry. We've been offering you guidance and advice from our experts and analysts on what we've heard from the former Prime Minister so far. Our coverage continues on Afternoon Live in just a moment. Stay tuned our way.
We brought together the leading thinkers from all over the world, and after extensive research, we have come to this conclusion.
7!
7 is definitely more than 3. That's why at Kia, all our cars now come with a 7-year warranty instead of 3. Because a longer warranty is a better warranty.
Dry, itchy skin. Scratching can damage skin. Fast-acting Lanacane cream has a soothing anti-itch formula. Lanacane to stop the itch and protect your skin.
It's the extra thick hardwood lipping that makes Wickes denim doors easy to fit, even when the frame is awkward. It's got our name on it, Wickes.
Even me with my heart problem. All Clear is the UK's specialist insurance provider for travellers with medical conditions. All Clear will deliver a quote by phone or on the All Clear website in a matter of minutes. You'd see a specialist for your condition, so see the specialist All Clear for your travel insurance.
And enjoy your trip. Apart from the odd minor hiccup.
Free phone 08000 28 95 28 or go online and give your travel plans the All Clear.
Please find a special place in your heart for Great Ormond Street Hospital and call 0800 44 42 44. Thank you.
This is going down now. You can either stand here and do nothing or you can help me stop it.
Call it in, I'm in pursuit!
Is that what I think it is?
We are code red. What the hell have you done? This is over!
Maybe for you, Jack, but I'm just getting started.
A double episode of Brand New 24, Sunday at 9, Sky One HD.
This is Afternoon Live. We're live from the Iraq Inquiry, where the former Prime Minister Tony Blair has been giving evidence so far this morning. How did he do? Let's find out. Joey Jones has been monitoring events for us. Joey, what have you picked out for us?
Okay, I wanted to demonstrate to people how it is that Sir John Chilcot and his colleagues demonstrated to Tony Blair right from the off this morning that they were boss. If you see, we've actually sped up the initial sequence from when they actually sit down. This is 10 times sped up. Tony Blair, not allowed to sit down at this point, had to listen to a rather lengthy preamble from Sir John Chilcot himself. Here we go. Here comes the man himself sitting down. Presumably might have thought he would have the opportunity to say a few words at the outset, and as you'll see, he fiddles with his microphone in expectation of something like that. But no, instead, and this is sped up 20 times now, off goes Sir John Chilcot again, launching into a further explanation as to the principles of the inquiry, so on and so forth. And even once we get to the first question from Sir Roderick Lyne, again, this goes on and on. And I think that what you're seeing there is that Tony Blair was, in effect, being made to sweat by the inquiry. They were saying to him, look, you may be the former Prime Minister, that's all very well and good, but this is our inquiry, we will handle it as we see fit, Kate.
OK, Joey, for now, thank you very much indeed. So we're expecting the former Prime Minister to take his seat again within the next few moments, at almost 2 o'clock. That's when we expect him to go back into the chamber. Watch it live here on Sky News Afternoon Live. Very good afternoon to you. You're watching Afternoon Live. It's 2 o'clock. We've been hearing from the former Prime Minister Tony Blair saying that it was his decision alone to go to war with Iraq and that he would do it again. He stands by his claim that Saddam's WMD programme was beyond doubt and growing, but sought to play down a comment in which he said he'd remove Saddam even if he'd known he didn't have those weapons. Hundreds of anti-war demonstrators gather outside the centre to vent their anger at the former PM and accuse him of being a coward for being driven to a side entrance 2 hours before he was due to give evidence. The questioning of Mr. Blair will resume in the next few moments. We're live at the Iraq Inquiry throughout the afternoon. And we're bringing you in more detail what the former Prime Minister has to say, giving several hours of evidence already this morning, due to go back into the chamber around about 2 o'clock. In fact, we do think he's just wandering back into the chamber now. Just a quick look at those pictures for you. Here we go.
Welcome back, Mr. Blair. For the benefit of those who were not able to be in the room this morning, can I just repeat 2 things that were said this morning at the start of proceedings? We recognise that witnesses are giving evidence based in part on their recollection of events, and we, of course, cross-check what we hear against the papers to which we have access. And I have reminded each witness that he will later be asked to sign a transcript of evidence given to the effect that that evidence is truthful, fair and accurate. And I would now like to continue the proceedings and turn to Sir Lawrence Freeman. No, I beg your pardon. To Sir Rodline.
Mr. Blair, I'd just like to pick up a couple of points that follow on from where you and Sir Lawrence left it before lunch. Just to finish off the diplomatic and political decisions that you faced in the days before you had to take the decision that we should start military action. And there's only 2 points on this I think I want to ask about now. The first one concerns the position of the French government, which you did refer to before lunch. In your final speech before the conflict to the House of Commons on the 18th of March, you told the Commons that, and I'll quote here, France said it would veto a second resolution whatever the circumstances. Those on the Security Council opposed to us will not countenance any new resolution that authorises force in the event of non-compliance. Had the French been on to us after President Chirac's interview of the 10th of March, in the days after that and before you made that statement, had they indeed told Number 10 through diplomatic channels that we were misinterpreting President Chirac's words by misinterpreting the context of his statement, whatever the circumstances, had they told us that, in the view of the French government, Chirac had not been saying that France would vote no against any resolution. He was referring to this resolution at this time.
I believe I spoke to President Chirac myself. I think it was on the 14th of March. So this is actually, you know, after that time. The French position was very, very clear. It wasn't that they veto any resolution, it's that they would veto a resolution that authorised force in the event of breach. And the point was this, that if we were going to come back to the United Nations and get another resolution, it had to be a resolution that said something stronger and tougher than 1441. And therefore, the idea was to say, because we'd been through 1441, Saddam was not in compliance, OK, if we come back for another resolution, then this has got to authorise action.
So you didn't feel that there was any possibility that if we'd pursued inspections for a longer period to the point where the French, and perhaps Blix was reporting that the process was exhausted, that at that stage the French would have been prepared to vote for a resolution authorising military action?
I really, my judgment, having spoken to Jacques Chirac, and we kept perfectly good lines open actually throughout this, and I was very anxious to make sure for the aftermath situation that we came back together again in the UN Security Council. So I wasn't, you know, trying to be in a position where France and Britain, as it were, fell out. But it was very, very clear to me. The French, the Germans and the Russians had decided they weren't going to be in favour of this. And there was a straightforward division, frankly. And I don't think it would have mattered how much time we'd taken. They weren't going to agree that force should be used.
In any circumstances at any time on this track?
Well, unless there'd been something absolutely dramatic that the inspectors had uncovered, that might have made a difference to them. But the mere fact that he was in breach of 1441, despite this being his final opportunity, my judgment, I have to say, and I think this is pretty clear, is that there was by then a political divide on this of a pretty fundamental nature.
As we hadn't got 9 votes, positive votes in the bag, a French vote against wouldn't actually have been a veto. Is there any substance in the charge that by making so much of the French veto, we were actually using it as an excuse to withdraw the resolution, which wasn't going to succeed anyway, so that we could meet the American timetable and go into action?
No, the actual situation, because I had many conversations with other leaders at the time, and most of those were with President Lagos of Chile, who I knew well, I had a very good personal relationship with, and he was in a tough situation, as we all were at that time. And what President Lagos was effectively saying to me was, look, if you can get to a stage where you can loosen the French opposition, then it's a lot easier for us to come along with you. So it was very bound up with, as it were, what was then becoming in the Permanent Five, a disagreement. UK and America on one side, France and Russia on the other.
So you hadn't really reached a point in the week or so before the resolution was withdrawn where you'd effectively had to give up your hopes of getting President Lagos and maybe your hopes that President Bush could persuade the Mexicans to come on side, and decide that you'd have to sort of plan an end game in which our position was presented in the best way it could be?
Well, I think it was more that I thought it was worth having one last-ditch chance to see if you could bring people back together on the same page. And so, in a sense, what President Bush had to do was to agree to table a fresh resolution. What the French had to agree was you couldn't have another resolution and another breach and no action. So my idea was define the circumstances of breach. That was the tests that we applied with Hans Blix. Get the Americans to agree to the resolution. Get the French to agree that you couldn't just go back to the same words of 1441 again. You had to take it a stage further. Now, that was the idea I had. I thought it might be possible to bring everyone back together again. It wasn't possible to do that. And I was also very conscious by that time as well of the need to bring the UN back into the situation after a conflict, and so that was a factor in my mind as well. As I say, I wanted to try and, as far as possible, make sure that you didn't end up with as it were, a political disagreement becoming a really ugly political situation between the major countries in the Security Council.
Okay, if I just move on to my other point, which is a slightly wider point, at this really critical moment, and obviously a very difficult moment in your life, you'd reached the stage where you weren't going to get a second resolution, military action was imminent. Now, you had been working intensively for months, indeed for a year, to try to create a supportive environment. We've discussed elements of that already, but you hadn't actually got a clear and strong international consensus for this action. Public opinion here in the UK was divided. No really major progress had been made on the Middle East peace plan, which you and I discussed earlier. We hadn't got the second resolution, and you were also, I think by this stage, starting to hear warnings from people like Brigadier, as he was, I think Tim Cross, who came to see you in Downing Street, and Sir Alistair Campbell, I think, that the post-conflict preparations being made by the Americans didn't look at all good. At this point, you must, I suppose, have had some pause for thought. Did President Bush, at this point, when you hadn't really satisfied the preconditions you wanted to achieve, offer to go it alone and offer you a way out?
I think the Americans would have done that. I think President Bush actually at one point shortly before the debate said, look, if it's too difficult for Britain, we understand. But I took the view very strongly then and do that it was right for us to be with America, since we believed in this too. And it is true that it was very divisive. But it was divisive in the sense that there were two groups. There was also a very strong group in the international community, in Parliament, I would say even in the Cabinet, who also thought it was the right thing to do. And so, for example, in the European Union at the time, I think 13 out of the 25 members were with America. Japan, South Korea were with America. Major allies lining up with America.
Yeah. Clearly there was support, but I suppose this was a long way short of what you would have hoped to have had.
Look, I would have hoped to have had a United Nations situation in which everyone was on the same page and agreed. Sometimes that doesn't happen.
I mean, in Kosovo, one didn't have unanimity because the Russians threatened to veto, but you had much stronger support. The first Gulf War, there was pretty well universal support, Afghanistan and so on. So this was a much more difficult situation for you.
It was a really tough situation, yes. And in the end, as I say, what influenced me was that my judgment ultimately was that Saddam was going to remain a threat, and that is in this change in the perception of risk after September the 11th, it was important that we were prepared to act. Our alliance with America was important, and just to put this very clearly, we'd been down a UN path that I genuinely hoped would work. I mean, I hoped that 1441 would avoid conflict.
Although I think you said this morning you weren't terribly confident it was going to work. You hoped it would work.
I did hope it would work. I wasn't confident about Saddam, and I think for perfectly good reasons. He was someone who'd been defying the UN for 10 years, and as we know now, he hadn't really changed his intent. So I could see a situation in which you might be faced with this tough choice, but I was doing absolutely everything I could to try and avoid having to do it.
No. Jack Straw the other day referred to a plan B that he'd floated with you. I think, I don't remember his exact words, but implying that he saw a case for it, which would have involved only partial involvement by us in the military action, but not sending the ground troops in, as I understand it. What was your view of his advice?
Well, that was a possibility. As I think we discussed this morning, in fact, our own military, in a sense to their great credit, were in favour, if we were going to be part of this, to be wholehearted.
Well, they're bound to. I mean, they're out there ready to go, and troops in that situation don't want to have to come back again, do they?
No, this was even back in October. I think if you look at the record back in October 2002, the military was saying of their preferences for the three options.
But I'm now thinking of the last week before the action.
Sorry, but I thought you were meaning to suggest it was just because the troops were down there. I think, to be fair, and I think Mike Boyce would say this to you, that they wanted to be a wholehearted part of this, and I thought that was right as well, as I discussed. It would have been a very big thing for us to have kept out of the aftermath as well. And of course, it was in the aftermath that some of the most difficult things happened. And the British forces performed absolutely magnificently, both during the invasion and afterwards.
Well, some have argued the opposite. I mean, some of our earlier witnesses have said that by going in with a large force, we actually hoped that we could then take the combat troops out at a fairly early stage, in the hope that other people would come in and take up some of the load in the aftermath. Now, reversing that, if we'd not sent the force in at this stage for this variety of reasons, we could then still have said, in a very respectable way, that we're ready to come in and do the sort of peace-building, nation-building stuff that we've got a lot of experience in the aftermath. So it wasn't keeping us out of the aftermath by not going in at this stage, was it?
Sorry, I meant precisely the opposite, exactly what you're saying, Sir Roderick. In other words, we would have been as part of the aftermath, and actually, as it turned out, for reasons that we didn't foresee, as it turned out, it was the aftermath that was the most difficult and toughest part of this. And what I'm saying is, to have kept out of the aftermath as well as the initial action, I think would have been very hard for Britain. But having said all of that, look, again, this is a judgment. You could have decided to do option 1 or 2. In the end, we decided to do option 3, and I think that was, I would say, the consensus view between political and military at the time. And just to say this to you, one of the things that I've done in every single piece of military action I advocated as Prime Minister is the first thing, in a sense, I do is get a sense from our armed forces as to whether they're committed and keen to do it. And of course they are, because that's the type of people they are, and they're fantastic. But it was a very much a conversation we had back in, I think, beginning actually even July time, and then building up through October, and then by the time we came to March, yes, it's true, we could have pulled back at that stage, but I believe that that would have been wrong, and I think it would have not indicated the strength of support that I felt was right for us to exhibit.
I'd like to change subject now, if I may. If my colleagues have got nothing further that they want to raise on this point. This morning, I registered that we would want to deal with all the legal issues, as it were, in one chapter. I think that's easier. I hope it's easier for you. I think it's easier for us. And of course, in the course of this week alone, we've had some 10 hours of evidence on this from the Attorney General and from 3 senior civil service legal advisors who were involved in the question. For that reason, we don't propose to try to go through the issues point by point again, which would take probably another 10 hours. But we really would like now to focus on the questions that most directly concerned you as Prime Minister. And the committee have suggested that the easiest way of tackling this extremely complex subject with all of this 10 hours of background behind us would be if I tried to summarise first what we as a committee have heard and read on this subject. And if you will forgive me, though it will allow you to rest your voice for a minute or two, this will take me a few minutes, though I think ultimately it will also save us some time. So if you're content, I will try to wrap up what we have absorbed on this subject in a number of points.
Before, just to interject, and then coming to specific questions based on that, is that satisfactory to you?
Yeah, and so I'll go through the summary. If you're not content with any points in it, please tell me. And then I've got 1 or 2 questions I'd like to ask arising from that. Firstly, there wasn't a legal basis, as Lord Goldsmith repeated to us the day before yesterday, for regime change as an objective in itself. Secondly, lawyers in the US administration favoured what was called the revival argument, and that meant that the authorization for the use of force during the first Gulf War, embodied in Resolution 687, was capable of being revived as it had been revived in 1993 and 1998. However, the UK's lawyers did not consider that this argument was applicable without a fresh determination by the Security Council. And they felt that not only because of the passage of time since Resolutions 678 and 687, but also because in 1993 and 1998, the Security Council had formed the view that there had been a sufficiently serious violation of the ceasefire conditions, and also because the force that had been used then had been limited to ensuring Iraqi compliance with the ceasefire conditions. And even in 1998, the revival argument had been controversial and not very widely supported. So the British argument was that you needed a fresh determination of the Security Council. If we turn then to the precedent of Kosovo, over Kosovo, Russia had threatened to veto a proposed Security Council resolution, and our lawyers believed that this precedent did not apply to these circumstances in Iraq, because in Kosovo we had had an alternative legal base to rely on, which was intervention to avert an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe. So what that led to was consistent and I think united advice by the FCO's legal advisors, and also insofar as it was at this stage sought or proffered by the Attorney General up to November 2002 that a fresh UN authorization under Chapter 7 would be required for the military action contemplated against Iraq, contemplated at that stage as a contingency, to be lawful. Such an authorization, in their view, would provide the only grounds on which, in these circumstances, force could be used. And so the UK and the USA went to the United Nations and obtained Security Council Resolution 1441, passed unanimously. However, in the words of Lord Goldsmith, that resolution wasn't crystal clear, and I think you yourself this morning referred to the fact that there were arguments. It didn't resolve the argument, I think was the way you put it. And the ambiguous wording of that resolution immediately gave rise to different positions by different Security Council members on whether or not it of itself had provided authorization without a further determination by the Security Council for the use of force. So up until early February of 2003, the Attorney General, again as Lord Goldsmith told us in his evidence, was telling you that he remained of the view that Resolution 1441 did not authorize the use of force without a further determination by the Security Council, that it was his position that a council discussion, the word discussion was used in the resolution, would not be sufficient, and that a further decision by the council was required. And I think perhaps as I'm about halfway through the summary and I've just reached the point before Lord Goldsmith gives you his formal advice, it might be sensible if I paused at half-time just to ask if, up to now, you think I've got it right in your own understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's a fair summary.
Right, well, if you're content, then I'll continue, and I hope to do as well with the second half, but I'm not the lawyer, and you are. On the 7th of March, Lord Goldsmith submitted his formal advice to you, a document which is now in the public domain. And in that, he continued to argue that, quote, the safest legal course, unquote, would be a further resolution. But in contrast to his previous position, and for reasons which he explained to us in his evidence, he now argued that, quote, a reasonable case, unquote, could be made, quote, that Resolution 1441 is capable in principle of reviving the authorization in 678 without a further resolution. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he coupled this with a warning that, quote, a reasonable case does not mean that if the matter ever came before a court, I would be confident that the court would agree with this view. So at that point, Lord Goldsmith had, to a degree, parted company with the legal advisors in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who've also given evidence to us through Sir Michael Wood and Miss Elizabeth Wilmshurst. They were continuing to argue that the invasion could only be lawful if the Security Council determined that a further material breach had been committed by Iraq. I emphasize the word further, of course, because 1441 established that Iraq was already in breach, but then the argument was about the so-called firebreak and whether you had to have a determination of a further material breach. Lord Goldsmith told us that when it became clear that we were not likely to get a second resolution, a further resolution, he was asked to give what he described as a yes or no decision, especially because clarity was required by the armed forces, the CDS had put this to him, and by other public servants. He had received also an intervention from a senior Treasury lawyer. So Having given you that advice on the 7th of March, by the 13th of March, he had crucially decided, and this is from a minute recording a discussion between himself and his senior advisor, David Brummel, who has also given evidence to us, and which is also on the public record. He had decided that, quote, on balance, the better view was that the conditions for the operation of the revival argument were met in this case, i.e., that there was a lawful basis for the use of force without a further resolution going beyond Resolution 1441. Now, there's one further stage in the process, and then I will get to the end. This view now taken by the Attorney General still required a determination that Iraq was, quote, in further material breach of its obligations. The legal advisors in the FCO considered that only the UN Security Council could make that determination. But the attorney took the view that individual member states could make this determination, and he asked you to provide your assurance that you had so concluded, i.e. you had concluded that Iraq was in further material breach. And on the 15th of March, which is, 5 days before the action began, you officially gave the unequivocal view that Iraq is in further material breach of its obligations. So it was on that basis that the attorney was able to give the green light for military action to you, to the armed forces, to the civil service, to the cabinet, and to Parliament. But it remained the case, as Sir Michael Wood made clear in his evidence, that while the Attorney General's constitutional authority was, of course, accepted by the government's civil service advisors on international law, headed by Sir Michael Wood, although Miss Wilmshurst herself decided to resign at this point from government service, they accepted his authority, but they did not endorse the position in law which he had taken. And it remains to this day Sir Michael's position, he said this in his witness statement, that, quote, the use of force against Iraq in March 2003 was contrary to international law. Now, my first question is, have I given a fair summary of the legal background?
Yes, I think that is a fair summary of the legal background. I would say, however, just one point, Sir Roderick, which is that what was so important to me about Resolution 1441 was not simply that it declared Saddam in breach, gave him a final opportunity, but it said also in Op 4 that a failure to comply unconditionally and immediately and fully with the inspectors was itself a further material breach. This was extremely important for us to secure in that resolution, and we did secure it. And what we kept out of 1441 was an attempt to ensure that we had to go back for another decision.
I went through that in considerable detail, as you probably saw, with the Attorney General, just to make sure that we clearly understood the different positions and the weight that was being given to evidence received from private conversations and what was said on the public record. So if you will allow me not go over all of that ground again, if you are content with the way that we discussed it with the Attorney General. And I would really move on to my next question, which is that going back to the first half of 2002, which we discussed right at the beginning of today, the period when your strategy was evolving away from containment for the reasons you explained and towards the American position, and therefore you were beginning to discuss the possibility or the contingency of having to use force. In that period of the first half of 2002, when you were having these discussions, did you seek legal advice from the attorney or indeed from anyone else?
we got a paper, I think it was an 8th of March paper, which set out the legal position. And that set it out in the terms that you had just summarised. I was obviously not just very interested in it for obvious reasons, but interested in it for this reason as well, that we had taken action in 1998. And we'd taken action on the basis of the revival of Resolution 678. So it was very important to me because we'd already taken military action. Indeed, as you rightly point out, military action had been taken in 1993 as well. But we had that before us, and one of the things that was most important in us going down the UN route was precisely the legal advice that we got.
Yep. So you wanted at that early stage to know the legal parameters. Do you remember where that advice came from? Was it from the Foreign Office's legal advisors, or?
I don't, but I may be able to.
If I put it another way, I think from our discussion with the Attorney General, it didn't come from him, because if I'm not misremembering his evidence, I don't think at that stage he had been consulted.
No, it came from the Foreign Office, actually.
It came from the Foreign Office. Could you say why, given this is pretty serious territory you were beginning to get onto, you didn't at that stage think it necessary to consult the Attorney General?
I mean, we were, in my view, a long way at that point from taking a decision. Had we come closer to the point of taking a decision, of course, we would have needed to have taken the formal advice of the Attorney General, as indeed we did. At that stage, we had the advice of the Foreign Office, and actually the Foreign Office advice was pretty much in line with what Peter Goldsmith then later advised me.
It was 100% in line, yeah, as we understand from both of them. So at that point, building the Attorney General into the process of forming policy, having him at meetings like, say, the meeting at Chequers you discussed, wasn't something you felt a need to do?
Not at that stage, because we were, as I say, at a very preliminary point. But what I took from the advice that we were given was that we needed a fresh resolution.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do point out that, because this was why, at a later stage, I became concerned as to what the legal problem was, because, of course, we got a further resolution.
If I could just stick a little bit for a couple of minutes with the Attorney General's role in this, because his evidence is very fresh in our minds. I mean, in previous governments, it was quite frequently the practice for Attorneys General to attend Cabinet, and indeed in some war cabinets, you didn't have a war cabinet before the conflict began here, but you had groups of advisors who met.
Well, and ministers, yes.
Ministers and advisors. Attorney Generals, sometimes in the past, quite frequently in the past, would have been there. Now, Lord Goldsmith told us that he had only attended Cabinet when the conflict began to discuss Iraq, although, as you said this morning, the Cabinet discussed Iraq over 20 times. And it was clear from his evidence, I think, that he was rarely included in the other discussions you were having around this subject, and that he had relatively few face-to-face meetings with you in 2002 and the early part of 2003, particularly in 2002, to discuss this subject, which I think raised the question in our minds as to why you hadn't thought it right to include him more closely.
Well, he was very closely involved in this, in the sense that he himself, and on his own initiative actually, and after that time, we obviously had a pretty close interaction on it. At the end of July 2002, wrote to me about his legal advice. It's correct, and I think this is in accordance with tradition, he didn't attend Cabinet until we got to the point we were actually going to take the decision. But back then, you know, we were a year off military action in March 2002. Now, had we got close to the point of military action, of course, Peter would have been very closely involved and actually began to be involved some, I think it's right to say, 8 months before the military action began.
But you actually got to the point, right close to the point, with him only having been to the Cabinet twice, the second time being on the eve of conflict.
Well, the issue is not how many times he comes to the Cabinet. The issue is whether he's giving his advice to the Prime Minister and to the ministers, and Peter was. And just to say this about Peter Goldsmith, as you will have seen from his evidence, Peter is absolutely a lawyer's lawyer. He's someone of extraordinary integrity. He's somebody who, actually, as a lawyer, is in the very top rank of the legal profession. And Peter made it quite clear from a very early stage of this that if he felt he had advice to give, he would give it. And in a sense, he would give it whether people wanted it or they didn't want it. But he was going to give it, and he did give it.
Well, he told us that he volunteered it after your meeting of the 23rd of July, when you were about to go off to see President Bush, and he'd volunteered written advice to you in a minute of the 30th of July, the text of which is not in the public domain. But he commented to us that this advice, he felt, had not been particularly welcome. We wondered why it wasn't particularly welcome to get advice then.
It was not that it wasn't particularly welcome, but it was, obviously I was dealing with what was already a difficult situation, and now I became aware we had to take a whole new dimension into account. Of course, we had at an earlier stage of this, but once we got into discussions with the Americans, I was well aware of the fact from March onwards that if we wanted to be legally secure on this, we had to go down the UN route. And that was one major part of why we decided to do this.
So basically you'd got the point, you didn't need to be constantly reminded of it.
No, but having said that, it actually was then very helpful for him to do this, because he focused our mind, quite rightly, on the need to get the right resolution in 1441.
So you just got the wrong vibes from the reaction at number 10?
Well, I don't know, but, you know, I know Peter very well, and he's someone I have a great respect for, and I'm sure, as indeed his...
I just, you know, he made this remark, so it's natural, indeed,
No, I think to be
to
frank and to be fair to him, he was deciding before I go to President Bush, and I think he'd worried about statements that had been made by various ministers.
Later on he was, yes.
He wanted to make it absolutely clear
yes,
that it wasn't merely, I think his point was it's not merely going down the UN route, it's getting the right resolution that will be important.
Well, let's turn to that resolution. Just after it was adopted, it was adopted on the 8th of November, Resolution 1441, and on the 11th of November, Lord Goldsmith talked to your Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell. He was a bit concerned that he was hearing second-hand views of his own opinions, and he wanted, I think, to get that straight. And he made clear to Jonathan Powell that he was not optimistic that Resolution 1441 would provide a sound legal basis for the use of force if Iraq were found in breach at a future stage, but without a second resolution. And he suggested that it was desirable for him to provide advice at that point, but he wasn't encouraged to do so. The response instead was that he could have a meeting sometime before Christmas at Downing Street, and that meeting duly took place on the 19th of December with some of your officials. And at that meeting, he was again told that he wasn't being called on to give advice at this stage. This stage being a stage at which he felt that 1441 had created an unclear situation. But what he was invited to do was to put a paper to you in draft of his advice, and he handed that, I think, personally to you on the 14th of January. Now, by then we're into a period in which the armed forces had actually been instructed to prepare for military action, and in which you were moving along the track towards an intended second Security Council resolution, though that wasn't tabled until late February, I think about the 24th from memory. Don't you think that it would have been useful, as he obviously felt, if you'd had the formal advice of the Attorney General ahead of these now increasingly important developments?
No, I think what was important for him to do was to explain to us what his concerns were. And look, all the way through this, there was as I know myself, lawyers take different views of issues. And an issue such as this, they were bound to take very different views. And Peter was quite rightly saying to us, these are my concerns, this is why I don't think 1441 in itself is enough. Now, we had begun military preparations even before we got the second the first resolution, the 1441 resolution. We had to do that, otherwise we'd never have been in a position to take military action. But let me make it absolutely clear. If Peter, in the end, had said, this cannot be justified lawfully, we would have been unable to take action.
But if you'd known that he was going to say that, it would have been helpful to have known that as soon as possible, because it could have prevented you from deploying a large force into the region and having to bring it back. So that's why I ask, wouldn't it have been helpful to have known your options at this...
Well, we did know our options, Mr. Roderick. We didn't get formal, in a sense, legal advice at that point, but Peter had made it clear what his view was. And then there was a whole iteration because the whole of the legal interpretation really revolved around, a bit like a statutory construction point for lawyers, what was in the mind of the people who passed the resolution. And as you rightly said earlier, the resolution, in one sense, was unclear. On the other hand, as to what people intended. On the other hand, I certainly felt where it was absolutely clear was that there had to be immediate, full and unconditional compliance, and any lack of that compliance was a further material breach. So, in my view, there had to be at least a strong prima facie case, if you could show material breach, that this justified the revival argument, since otherwise you couldn't have justified it in respect of 1998.
But at this stage, before the middle of February, he's not offering you options, nor are the Foreign Office legal advisors. They are saying, we have to have a further determination by the Security Council. Later on, it turned out that he was able to find an alternative option. In planning the policy, my point is, wouldn't it have been much easier for you to have known at this early stage that there was an alternative option that didn't involve a second Security Council resolution? You might then have decided not to make the huge effort that you then did make to get a second Security Council resolution, because by making that effort and then not getting it, it could be argued that you had then actually weakened the argument that you subsequently, or the position that you subsequently took on the revival argument. Wouldn't it have been helpful to have known that earlier?
Well, we did know, but because Peter made it clear, the best thing to do is to get another resolution. So we were well aware that that was his advice. The issue was really this.
But he was saying it's the only thing to do at this stage. He didn't offer you the alternative until after he'd been to Washington on the 11th of February.
Well, actually, it was two things, I think, to be fair to him, and I think it's very important that this is seen in its proper context. It all revolved around the interpretation of 1441, and the question was, what did the Security Council mean? And we were obviously arguing very strongly that the Security Council had agreed that he was in breach, given him a final opportunity, and any further breach was a material breach, and he had to comply fully.
But
and
that
what is
had
more,
to be determined by the Security Council.
Well, and the issue as to whether, because some people wanted actually that the Security Council had to take a decision, that was excluded. We refused to allow that precisely because we did not want to be in a situation where we were forced as a matter of law to come back for another decision. And people had nonetheless agreed 1441. So that was why there was at least as powerful an argument on the side of one resolution only as there was against it.
That's where you ended up in March, but until the 12th of February, you were not being told by the attorney or the Foreign Office legal advisors that you had the option of not getting a further decision out of the Security Council. They were telling you, both of them, that their reading of that resolution, which, as you rightly say, was unclear, but the British reading of that resolution, unlike the American resolution, was that the determination had to be made by the Security Council.
Yes, so there was a disagreement between where our legal position was at this stage and the American position. I think it was at our suggestion, actually, that Peter then went to talk to Jeremy Greenstock.
It was then that his position changed.
Yeah, but it's not just because of the Americans. What happened was he had a discussion with Jeremy Greenstock.
After which he wrote to you saying his position hadn't changed.
But he said it had been a very useful discussion and that had obviously moved him somewhat.
He told us that there were three things that moved him. Sir Jeremy Greenstock got him part of the way there. The negotiating history provided by the Foreign Secretary got him a further part of the way there. Going to Washington, talking to the Americans, got him yet another stage
Yes.
of the way there. That was his evolution. Well,
and it's fair to say, because I think it's important to say
it's
this,
very important.
It was always a very, very difficult, balanced judgment. But the important thing was, in the end, that Peter came to the view, and I think, as I say, anybody who knows him knows he would not have expressed this view unless he thought it and believed it. He came to the view that, on balance, the breach by Saddam Hussein of Resolution 1441 was sufficient, provided it was a breach of the obligation set out in Op. 4.
Well, he asked you to say that it was sufficient, but that's at the end of the game. Can I just go to the point where he's given you his formal advice of the 7th of March, but that didn't give the yes or no clear answer that the Chief of the Defence Staff and others wanted. That didn't come until the 13th of March, when he had had a period of further reflection. What discussions did you or others under your instruction, if any, have with Lord Goldsmith between the 7th of March, when you received his formal advice, and the 13th of March, when he decided that his position had evolved further?
I can't recall any specific discussions that I had. I don't know whether others would have had with him before the 13th of March. But essentially what happened was this. He gave legal advice. He gave an opinion saying, look, there is this argument against it, there is this argument for it, I think a reasonable case can be made. And obviously we then had to have a definitive decision. And that decision is, yes, it is lawful to do this or not. And
a huge amount hung on that decision.
Of course it did. A lot hung on that decision. And it was therefore extremely important that it was done by the Attorney General and done in a way which we were satisfied was correct and right. And that's what he did. And if I can just point this out too, if you go back and read Resolution 1441, I think it's quite hard to argue, as a matter of common sense, leave aside the issues to do with the precise interpretation of some of the provisions. 1441, the whole spirit of it was, we've been through 10 years of Saddam Hussein breaching UN resolutions. We finally decided he's going to be given one last chance. This is the moment when, if he takes that chance, there's no conflict, we resolve the matter. But if he doesn't take that chance and starts messing around again, as he started to do, then that's it.
So it's quite hard to argue what? Quite hard to argue that a further resolution is necessary?
Yeah, the further resolution was clearly politically preferable for us. If you can get everybody back on the same page again, it's clearly preferable. But if you actually examine the circumstances of 1441, the whole point about it, and this is the argument I used with the Americans successfully to get them to go down this route. And by the way, I should just point out, at the end of October 2002, I remember specifically a conversation with President Bush in which I said, if he complies, that's it. There's no, but this is important because people sometimes say, well, it was all kind of cast in stone
wasn't
from...
Number 10 saying to the White House in January and February, even into March, that it was essential from the British perspective, because of our reading of the law, to have a second resolution?
No, politically, we were
not
saying,
merely preferable, but essential.
No, politically, we were saying it was going to be very hard for us. Indeed, it was going to be
very hard. But weren't we saying it was legally necessary for us? Because that was the advice.
What we said is that legally, it resolves that question, obviously, beyond any dispute. On the other hand, for the reasons that I've given, Peter in the end decided that actually a case could be made out for doing this without another resolution. And as I say, did so, I think, for perfect...
Well, it must have been a considerable relief to you on the 13th of March when he told you that he'd come to the better view that the revival argument worked. Because at that point, he had given you, subject to you making the determination, the clear legal grounds that you needed.
Yes, and the reason why he'd done that was really very obvious, which was that the Blix reports indicated quite clearly that Saddam had not taken that final opportunity.
But he'd done it in disagreement with the international lawyers, all of them, as we understand from Sir Michael Wood, then in the government's employ.
Well, I think he'd also, I seem to remember, but I may be wrong in this, if I am, forgive me, but I think that he'd also sought the advice of Krista Greenwood.
He had,
PC,
and we discussed that, and it didn't appear from our discussion that there were many other people outside government arguing in the same direction that Lord Goldsmith eventually argued.
Well, obviously other countries, of course, were having the same issues as well,
yes,
and having to decide this. And it wasn't, I don't think it was right to say it was irrelevant that the American lawyers had come to a different view. So
clearly not irrelevant, because it had a big impact on him. But apart from America, were there other countries in which, I mean, we've heard recently what a Dutch review has found on this, but were there other countries in which people were arguing in favour of the revival argument?
Well, I think all countries who took the military action believed they had a sound legal basis for doing so. All I'm pointing out is that actually when you analyse 1441, it's less surprising as a conclusion to come to than sometimes is made out today, because the fact is 1441 was very deliberately constructed. It had, if you like, a certain sort of integrity as a resolution to it. It basically said, OK, one last chance, Saddam, to prove that you've had a change of heart, that you're going to cooperate. And he didn't.
Yeah, I mean, we're not lawyers. We've simply listened to the views of lawyers, Lord Goldsmith, Sir Michael Wood, Miss Wilmshurst, Mr. Bramell, and looked at what they told us about the balance of legal opinion on this subject. And Lord Goldsmith obviously was not in a position in which he had wide support within the international legal fraternity within the government, indeed any, I think, in the UK when he made his judgment. But he is a lawyer of the highest eminence, and they accepted his authority, even if they didn't agree with it. So that was the final position. So just...
Yes, but all I'm... Sorry,
yes,
forgive me,
please.
Roderick. All I'm trying to say is when you actually go back and read 1441, it's pretty obvious that you can make a decent case for this.
Well, let me not pass judgment on that. I'm asking questions and I don't have an opinion to state on it. I'd just like to ask one final question, I think, to wrap up this legal chapter. And this is really, you were in the position ultimately where you had to give this determination. You had to go through with the action. Lord Goldsmith was preparing, with the assistance of Christopher Greenwood, for the possibility of legal challenge. He knew that he'd taken a decision that some others, many others perhaps, were arguing with and were going to argue with. And he had put something to you that was described as a reasonable case, but nevertheless not one that he would have confidently put before a court. You then had to decide whether you were convinced that this was a strong enough legal basis to take a very serious action of participating in a full-scale invasion of another country. How convinced were you at this point of that you had a strong legal case for doing what you did?
I would put it in this way. What I needed to know from him was, in the end, was he going to say this was lawful? He had to come to a conclusion in the end. And, you know, I was a lawyer myself. I wrote many, many opinions for clients, and they tend to be on the one hand and on the other hand, but you come to a conclusion in the end. And he had to come to that conclusion. And incidentally, I think he wasn't alone in international law in coming to that conclusion for very obvious reasons. Because, as I say, if you read the words of 1441, it's pretty clear this was Saddam's last chance. So that's what he had to do. He did it. As I say, anybody who knows Peter knows he would not have done it unless he had believed in it and thought that was the correct thing to do. And that was, for us and for our armed forces, that was sufficient.
You weren't worried by him saying that he wouldn't expect to win in a court with this one?
Well, I don't know that he said he said not to win. He simply said that, you know, you're going to have there's a case either way. And there always was a case either way. That's why it would have been preferable politically, and to have removed any doubt, to have had the second resolution. But in the end, we got to the point in the middle of March when, frankly, we had to decide. We were going either to back away or we were going to go forward. And I decided, and for the reasons that I've given, that we should go forward.
There was a case either way, but one he described as the safest legal course, but that was no longer available. And the other, he said, was if the matter ever came before a court, a reasonable case does not mean that if the matter ever came before a court, I would be confident that the court would agree with this view. But I think, unless you have a further comment to make, I have finished, I think, with all the questions that I had on the legal case. I don't know if any of my colleagues have. Otherwise, I think we will move on to the next subject.
I think that brings us to the question of preparations and planning, the decision having been taken. So can I turn to Baroness Prichard to start us off?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Blair, this morning you said that your decision to contribute to full division was driven by your sense of what proper UK contribution should be to policy. Mm-hmm. At that stage, did you weigh up the implications of that decision? For example, the time that would be required to acquire equipment and such like?
Yes, of course. I mean, part of the purpose of asking for papers that describe the different levels of military commitment that you might give is precisely in order to be able to learn what it is that you would be required to do. But in these situations, you're very, very dependent, rightly, on the advice that you're given from the Ministry of Defence and from the military.
But a fundamental underlying assumption of the Strategic Defence Review, which in case your government initiated in 1997, was that there would always be sufficient warning time for any operation at medium or large scale to build up equipment, stores and ammunition. And in the case of a large-scale operation, it said, such a substantial contribution to invading Iraq, the necessary lead time would be 6 months. And this was necessary to allow for call-up and preparation of reserves, including medics, and to take account of the industry's capacity to build up stocks. Now, on the basis of your government's planning assumptions, therefore, in order to prepare for the possibility, however slim, a large-scale military action in the spring of 2003, that 6-month clock would have started ticking in autumn 2002. But David Manning had told us that you sought to delay the decision as long as possible. And we've also heard from Lord Boyce and, of course, from Mr. Hoon about the restrictions placed on the visible military preparations in December 2002. I mean, were you aware what the implications of that would be? Or anybody made you aware of the implications of the delay?
Absolutely. What was important was to be very clear that you could not do this unless the military were ready to do it. And yes, it's true, as I think I explained this morning, for a time we were worried about the visibility of all the planning. We were doing a certain amount of planning, but you then reach another level when you have to make it very visible and very clear. We didn't want to do that for fear of triggering an assumption that we were actually going to do military action, irrespective of what was going to be happening at the United Nations. However, when I think it was at the end of October 2002, Jeff Hoon said to me, we've really got to get on with this now. We did. And I know that Mike Boyce said to you in his evidence that he was confident that the UK military was fully ready by the time we took the military action.
But I mean, was that assurance given to you because they wanted to give you a view of they had a can-do approach, do you think?
No, the one thing about the military, in my experience, is they tell you very bluntly, quite rightly, what their situation is, what they want, what they don't want, and what they think about things. And Mike was very, very clear that they had the readiness. I think there was something like 250 different urgent operational requirements that went into this. All of them, I think Kevin Tebbett told you this, were properly met. And incidentally, had anyone at any stage come to me and said, it's not safe to do this because of the lack of proper military preparation, I would have taken that very, very seriously indeed. But they didn't, and they got on with it, and they did it magnificently, as they always do.
They did, but I think you would appreciate that, they only actually had about it was in January, I think, that there was a formal approval given. So that was only about, I think, a couple of months,
Well, I thought
before
that
the
Jeff
operation.
came to, sorry, Baroness, I thought that Jeff had come to me at the end of October, and there had been a lot of work, though, going on prior to this.
That's true, but there was no visible preparedness. And things like the provision of essential kit, medical supplies, combats, boots, body armor, very important in a situation where there could be threat of nuclear, biological and chemical protection, clothing, ammunition. I mean, as it happened, the kit did not arrive late, and that was the case.
Yes, and it was very important, but I mean, just let me emphasize to you, on these issues to do with logistics, and there's an expertise that the Army have on this, I needed to know from them that they could do it and they would be ready, and that's what they assured me, and they were.
So what you're saying to me, that nobody spelled out to you the implications of not being prepared in time, given the fact the lead time needed for this kind of large-scale operation was 6 months?
No, they were absolutely spelling out the implications, which is why Jeff Hoon came to me and said, we've now got to get this visible and get a move on with it. We had a meeting, I think, with the Chief of Defence Staff and others, and I just want to emphasise one thing. My attitude has always been, I don't think I refused a request for money or equipment at any point in time that I was Prime Minister. And my view very, very strongly is when you're asking your armed forces to go into these situations, you put everything to one side other than making sure that they have the equipment they need and they have the finance there to back it up. And as far as I'm aware, and as I say, I think this was their evidence to you, they got it ready and they got it ready in time.
But the point is, the formal approval did not come till January anyway, and in fact, we do know that that was the case. The equipment was late.
Well, I didn't know, I mean, as I say, that there are, as it were, issues to do with logistics that they're far better able to tell you about. All I know is that they regard themselves as ready, and what is more, they performed as ready. I mean, they did an extraordinary job.
But can I ask another question? Because if the view was that you were going through the United Nations route and there was a military threat, why were you reluctant to have any visible preparation?
Well, we changed and we did have the visible preparation.
But that came later, see, that's my point.
Exactly, but there was always a concern in, if you like, the middle part of 2002, because people were constantly saying, they made up their minds, nothing's going to alter it, we're now set on a military course. And so we were anxious to make sure people did not think there was an inevitability about this, because one of the things I would emphasize to you is there really wasn't. If the UN route had worked successfully, however many doubts you could have on the past behavior of Saddam, if it had worked successfully, the whole thing would not have happened. We would have taken the UN path and made it work.
I now want to turn to the general aftermath planning, because on the 21st of January 2003, you, giving evidence to the liaison committee, you said, you cannot engage in military conflict and ignore the aftermath. In other words, if we, at this stage of military conflict, we also have to get a very proper worked out plan as to what happens afterwards and how the international community supports that well and so on. Now, several witnesses have told us that the planning for and the resourcing for the aftermath of the war was important, if not more important than planning for resourcing of the war itself. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened? Because, this was inadequate. And a lot of people have said it didn't quite work.
Well, first of all, I think we've got to divide it into two sections here. Actually, we did an immense amount of pre-war planning. I think Mike Boyce again said to you in his evidence that they spent as much time on phase 4 as the other phases of the operation. We had the officials meeting, obviously. We had the ad hoc meetings. We had cabinet meetings, actually, that were discussing these issues. The real problem was that our focus was on the issues that in the end were not the issues that caused us the difficulty. It wasn't an absence of planning, it was that we planned for certain eventualities, and when we got in there, we managed to deal with those eventualities, but we discovered a different set of realities, and then we had to deal with those. So the vast bulk of the pre-war planning was focused on the humanitarian, number one, I think probably more than anything else. Indeed, I think there was a House of Commons Select Committee report on the 6th of March 2003 saying you've got to do even more on the humanitarian side. All the focus was on that. Then there
but
was
we
an issue.
also have evidence, and I think these letters have been declassified, that Claire Short was writing to you for a pretty long time on the level of involvement that differed, and she was drawing this to your attention from a pretty early time.
Yes, but I think if you analyse those letters, they focused especially on the humanitarian side. They
do, but what she was complaining about was the preparedness and the timing when it was done. Not attention wasn't being paid to that.
Exactly so, and that's why we were trying to make sure that we redoubled our focus. And when we went in there, I would simply say that on the humanitarian side, and that was the main thing people were warning about, we didn't end up with a humanitarian disaster. In fact, we avoided, and we avoided in many ways because of the work that DFID and other agencies did. The other two things that she and others were warning about were the oil fields being set on fire and the use of chemical and biological weapons. So there was an immense amount of planning going on, but we planned with one assumption that turned out to be wrong, and then we also ended up with a fresh problem that I don't think people foresaw.
But that raises another issue, that one, how adequate was the planning, and had you ensured that planning covered all the full range of situations you may face post-conflict Iraq? This is not only the issues that you might face directly linked to military action, but it's about security, political, economic challenges that you might face. Because in a way, the whole idea was to kind of reconstruct Iraq. So had you planned adequately for these eventualities?
Yes, for what we thought we were going to encounter in Iraq, I think we did plan adequately. We actually had a perfectly sensible plan, which was to make sure that, because from January onwards it was clear we were going to have responsibility in the south, that we would be able, for example, to put together very quickly a group of Iraqis in Basra that would be able to take over greater responsibility. But one of the planning assumptions, and I was just looking this up now, and I think Andrew Turnbull gave you evidence to this effect, the planning assumption that the MOD, the Foreign Office, I think DFID, everybody made, was that there would be a functioning Iraqi civil service. In other words, that you would remove the top level, but you would have a functioning system underneath it. And I think one of the major lessons of this is to understand that where you have these types of states that are, in the case of Iraq, a sort of semi-fascist state, if you like, which really operated by fear on the population from a small number of people, that assumption is going to be wrong. You're going to be dealing with a situation where you probably have to rebuild the civil infrastructure of the country from nothing. And that's what we found. And you will have heard from the evidence of the generals and others when they went into Basra, contrary to what we thought, and the MOD planning assumptions, we found a completely broken system.
We'll come to that, but I think you quoted Lord Turnbull. I mean, the decision, as I said, to contribute a substantial land force to the coalition, I mean, were you aware that we would occupy the south and eastern Iraq, and that we would assume responsibilities as an occupying power under the Geneva and Hague Conventions? Because let me finish, because what Lord Turnbull said, I thought was very important. He said, had we stuck with option 2, we would have had warships and aircraft, but we wouldn't have had the large numbers of people other than special forces on the ground, and we would not have been the occupying power with everything that flowed from it. Now, that's what I meant about the implications.
It's correct that I think from about early January onwards, we knew that we would be in a position where we were going to have to handle the situation in the south. That was actually, I think, preferable to us, frankly, from the situation originally contemplated, which is that you came in from the north. That was part of the commitment that we were able to make. We then knew we would be joined by the forces of other nations.
Were you aware of that when you took the decision?
I think from January onwards, it was clear that we were going to be in a position where we were going to be in charge of Basra. But the whole assumption was, and you see this very clearly from the documents, is that you would come in. For the first stage, obviously the army would be the main people in charge. You would then bring your civilian people in behind that. You would then, as swiftly as possible, turn it over to the Iraqis themselves. And the idea was to get an Iraqi interim administration up running very quickly.
But that, I mean, that happened, I think, after we got the Security Council Resolution 1483. And
yes, that was also a very important part of what we wanted to do. We wanted to bring the United Nations
back
in.
Why did we, unlike other coalition members, accept the status of a joint occupying power?
Because we were the key partner of the US in this. We believed in it. We believed it was right to be there for the reasons that I've given. And we were prepared to accept the responsibility of then putting the country right.
Did we actually weigh up all the liabilities, the risks and the implications, the resources required?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we made very clear, I think I made this clear on a number of occasions, is that we could not walk away from our commitment to people in Iraq afterwards. But I believe, for all the reasons I've given, that this was an important commitment for us to make. The whole reason why we then had quite a detailed and difficult discussion, actually, with the Americans about the United Nations then coming back in for the aftermath was precisely because we knew for ourselves, and again, I think Peter Goldsmith was advising this, that we needed that cover, that military cover, and 1483 effectively endorsed the coalition presence.
But why is it that so many witnesses have said to us that the aftermath planning was deficient?
Well, I think, first of all, a lot of the criticisms have been directed at the American system. Now, all I would say about that is, I think, like you, if you look at the RAND report or the Inspector General's report, I think done in 2009, in America, I think it lays out very clearly the problems in pre-war planning, the problems in post-war execution. I think for ourselves, you know, if we knew then what we know now, I mean, we would, of course, do things very differently. On the other hand, for what we thought we were going to have, we had planned for it, and we actually met those eventualities.
But you say that criticisms were directed at the Americans, but what had you agreed with President Bush about the aftermath?
What we'd agreed was that, I mean, this was the whole dispute really about the United Nations. We were saying the United Nations had to come back into this situation. In the end,
but they were very reluctant to give the United Nations a role, and that is something, I think, which we wanted. And there was a resistance from the Americans?
Yes, that's absolutely right, Baroness, but in the end, the Americans agreed that they should have what we called a vital or central role.
But Andrew Turnbull said we were being fobbed off by Bush when he said that.
Well, I think if you actually look at what then happened with the United Nations in Iraq, I think Resolution 1483 is really a very important resolution. I mean, I don't know whether you want to look at it now. I'm perfectly content to do it, but
I have got it, but
yeah. Well, let me just, rather than refer to it, let me just make this very simple point. I saw Kofi Annan, I think, on the, I think it was around the 16th of April. In other words, shortly after the military action had begun. And I had a good and close relationship with Kofi Annan, and someone I respected very much. He'd been in a very difficult position throughout the last few months. He made it clear that the UN had to be independent of the coalition, but he also made it clear he wasn't arguing for the lead role. What he was arguing for...
Well, in the circumstances, not surprising, the fact that it had been a coalition-led invasion, and he did not want the full responsibility of reconstruction. That is not surprising.
Yeah, correct, but that is why when people say that, as it were, the UN should have been given the lead role, I'm simply pointing out the fact that he didn't want that. What he did want was a vital role, which is what we got the Americans to agree to. And if you look at Resolution 1483, it sets out the areas in which his special representative, which he agreed to appoint, was going to have influence and say. And actually, that special representative, Sergio Vieira de Mello, was absolutely excellent, would have made an enormous difference to Iraq and its future, but the terrorists killed him, assassinated him in August 2003.
I understand, but I want to go back to the point, because my recollection is that as early as September 2002, a number of very sensible questions were being asked in Parliament about the aftermath planning. And we have also been told that you were given rather an optimistic view by the Americans, who thought it would be all right on the day.
Well, the Americans were making efforts, actually. But I think, as I say, if you read the Inspector General's report or you read the RAND report, it's very clear. Things could have been done differently. I think the American administration, or the American system, as it were, has accepted that.
But I understand you personally became involved in the aftermath around about February 2003. Was that not too late?
No, I was personally involved in what was going to happen before then. As we came to the point of actually going in, it's true we had a meeting, I think, in February 2003 and then subsequent meetings. But the absolutely central point, since we're trying to see, well, what are the lessons that we can learn, is that unfortunately what we thought was going to be the problem didn't turn out to be the problem.
That's true, but I think I go back to my earlier point. It is the adequacy of the planning on a whole range of things, economic, political, because in a way there was a danger, there was information that Iraq could have fractured, given the insecurity of the Kurds, what could have happened with Shias and Sunnis, and I mean, there's a whole range of eventualities for which you planned for.
Yes.
That wasn't done.
Well, I would say we most certainly did plan for the problems in relation to the potential for a Sunni-Shia Kurd split. And what we tried to do was to make sure that as soon as possible, we brought the Sunnis and the Kurds and the Shia together. And so what actually happened, and this happened in May, I mean, only just a few weeks after the invasion, they brought together, I think it was called the Iraq Governing Council, or the Interim Governing Council. That had a membership of 25. I think there were 13, or I think it was 13 Shia and 11 Sunni and one.
But before that, I mean, decision was taken. For example, the ORA was actually replaced by CPA, and changes were made without any consultation with us.
Well, I think, look, what actually happened was it became very clear that ORHA was not capable of doing this.
I know that, but my point is that in terms of working together, if we were a joint occupying power, were we being consulted? Were we exerting the kind of influence we needed to?
I think we were being consulted on the questions everyone thought would arise. But it's true. I mean, Tim Cross and others were coming back and saying this system is not, it's not working in the way it should. And we were then interacting very strongly with the Americans. The only thing I say is that had we had even more focus on it, we would have still been focusing essentially on the humanitarian side with an assumption that we would inherit a functioning civil service infrastructure. And it was that assumption that proved to be wrong. And I think one of the reasons why we set up, and I know you've had evidence about this, what's called the Stabilization Unit in 2004, was precisely because we recognized in the future, and I think this is what the American system now knows, for sure, if you're going to go into a situation like this, you've got to go in as nation builders, and you've got to go in with a configuration of the political and the civilian and the military that is right for a failed state situation. Now, it doesn't mean to say that you don't do it, but you need to be prepared for it.
But the point really is our assumption was that we would get the United Nations to take a lead role. Eventually that didn't happen. But did we have a plan B then? Because in a sense, all I'm really wanting to get at is the ability to plan for eventualities.
Well, we did a plan for those eventualities. We did an analysis of what they might be, and we worked them out. The trouble was, we didn't plan for two things. One was, as I say, the absence of this properly functioning civil service infrastructure. And of course, the second thing, which is the single most important element of this whole business of what happened afterwards, people did not think that Al-Qaeda and Iran would play the role that they did. And we could have, if what you'd ended up having was essentially an indigenous violence or insurgency, or the criminality and the looting and the so on. Again, there are issues to do with the numbers of troops, the types of troops, and all those.
We will actually come to that later, and I want to now pass on to Sir Martin Gilbert.
I just wanted to...
Yeah, you can finish.
Yes, do finish.
Sorry, I just wanted to finish by saying that all of those are very important questions. We could have handled the situation if that had been the problem. It was the introduction of the external elements of AQ and Iran that really caused this mission very nearly to fail. Fortunately, in the end, it didn't. And the reason why that is important is that in itself, in my view, is a huge lesson, because those are the same forces that we're now facing. Afghanistan, right round the region.
As I've said, that's an area we're going to cover later.
Thank you.
No, I think we'll take a break in a moment. I just wanted, in hearing this set of exchanges and reading a great deal and hearing a good deal of evidence, that there was, in terms of the planning for the aftermath on the British side, leave aside the Americans, and we've seen the Rand report and the Hard Lessons report, there was a single set of assumptions which regrettably turned out to be very over-optimistic about what we would find. But there appears to have been no real risk analysis looking at best case, middle case, worst case, and at the resource and planning horizon implications of that. What we did know, and I would not like to sound like Donald Rumsfeld, we knew very little about the condition of things inside Saddam's Iraq. We had no embassy, we had no direct means. John Scarlett told us it was not a natural intelligence target. In principle, we could have amassed a good deal of knowledge, but none of it sufficient. Question, looking to the future, the lesson to be drawn. Is it ever safe to look at a single set of assumptions unless they can be tested quite rigorously against a worst-case background?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think that actually we did, because the MOD did a massive amount of work on there's a whole planning assumptions paper, as you know. And we did focus on this. We really tried to drill down on it. And one of the reasons why in early 2003 I was having quite difficult exchanges of correspondence with Claire Short particularly was because, rightly, she was getting worried that the humanitarian side was not going to be adequately advanced. I think in the future, you're best to make this assumption, actually, that these types of failed states, I don't know whether you describe Iraq as a failed state or, as I say, a kind of semi-fascist state, but whatever it was a wholly dysfunctional system. If we're required to go into this type of situation again, you might as well assume the worst, actually, because it's going to be, you are dealing with states that are deeply repressive, very secretive, power is controlled by a very small number of people, and it's always going to be tough. Now, I think the real question, in a way, for us as a country, because I think whatever preparations you made, this was always going to be tough, is, are we prepared to engage in this? Are we actually prepared to be in there for the long term on nation building in these difficult situations, fighting a completely different type of terrorist and insurgency threat?
Thank you. It may have turned out to be an expensive lesson, but one very necessary to learn. Let's have a break for about a quarter of an hour. Can I just remind the audience that people will need to be back here, I suggest within 10 minutes, to be certain of getting in and back through the security if you go out, because we shall need to start dead on time, and if you're not in here, I'm afraid that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the end of the first session this afternoon. Didn't really learn that much more, did we? We heard from Tony Blair that was basically suggesting that Saddam Hussein knew that he was drinking in the Last Chance saloon, but he ignored those warnings. Not really gleaned that much more so far this afternoon. At the break, it looks as though it's Tony Blair 1, panel 0. Stay tuned for more.
Well, I was delivering to a customer. I had to go through a narrow iron gateway. The gate swung in on me, crushed me against the other side of the gate post.
If you've been injured in an accident at work and it wasn't your fault, you could get compensation. Call BGR Bloomer on 0800 1777 010. Their service is absolutely free.
I thought they were just excellent service.
BGR Bloomer. Fast, friendly and free.
If only everything in the morning was so simple.
Hillary's best ever January blind sale ends soon. Don't miss out. Every range is up to half price, including new and best-selling fabrics, whites and creams, and even shutters. That's up to half price, measured, made and fitted just for you. Hurry! Our best ever blind sale ends on the 31st of January. So don't miss out. Book your appointment today on 0800 916 7796 or visit hillarys.co.uk.
For one-off emergency boiler repairs at a fixed price, remember 0800 000 999 or text boiler to 83040 to save it to your mobile.
Really good. Yes, can I ask you a question?
Okay, yes.
I'm wondering if...
Billy.
That's what I was wondering.
You could earn 35k or more a year.
At Direct Line Car Insurance, we've been coming to the rescue and bringing you great deals for 25 years.
To celebrate, we're offering 52 days' worth of free car insurance. Yuppie!
In 1985, we cut out the middleman to save you money.
Today, we cut out price comparison websites, so you're never sure of the best deal until you come to us direct. Crikey, 80s phones were big.
Not as big as the hair. So for 52 days' worth of free car insurance, call us now.
Or visit directline.com. OK, yeah.
Andy. Andy, I think I had something downstairs. Go have a look.
Take out Sainsbury's Building and Contents Insurance, and while you're with us, get double Nectar points for 2 years on every Sainsbury's shop. Sainsbury's Finance. Make shopping more rewarding.
No! People leave more than footprints as they travel through life.
Our daughters, they're gone. What if they could come back? What kind of sick, twisted stuff are you doing here?
You can see
your daughter again. Isn't that worth whatever price you have to pay? She's a perfect copy. You can't copy a soul.
Brand new Caprica starts Tuesday from 9 with a double episode, Sky One HD.
Hello again, you're watching Afternoon live from the Iraq Inquiry. Been hearing from the former Prime Minister Tony Blair today, just taking a short break. Back in a few moments' time. Just gives us time to speak to our political correspondent Joey Jones. What highlights from the previous session for you, Joey?
OK, well, obviously this past session was focusing on two areas, the legal justification for going to war and the post-war planning. And I think that it is absolutely true to say that Tony Blair didn't give an inch on either of them. One thing, though, I did notice is that Baroness Prashar, who's been widely criticised as the weakest of the questioners there, I think she may have taken that to heart a bit, and she was quite... well, she did give, she made it absolutely clear to Tony Blair who was boss, at one point telling him not to interrupt her, and at another point appearing to rather lecture him on her views. So clearly she couldn't be accused of just rolling over in that section of questioning. But if you look at the legal element, first of all, it was clear that the Prime Minister, essentially, he felt right from the start that the view at which the Attorney General eventually arrived in March was the right one. He maintained it throughout, and so to that extent he was able to brush off many of the questions. First of all, when Roderick Lyons had asked him why it was that the Attorney General Peter Goldsmith had felt that advice that he had volunteered to the Prime Minister before he set off to meet President Bush in July of 2002 was, in his view, quote, not welcome.
We wondered why it wasn't particularly welcome to get advice then.
It was not it wasn't particularly welcome, but it was... Obviously, I was dealing with what was already a difficult situation, and now I became aware we had to take a whole new dimension into account. Of course, we had at an earlier stage of this.
And that whole new dimension, of course, that he said he had to take into account was quite simply, one presumes, the legality of the action and ensuring that it was legal. So Roderick Lyons also asked about why it was, the motivation for pursuing that second resolution in January, February and March of 2003. One would have imagined that the government would have been in an awful panic needing to get this second resolution, because the Attorney General's advice at that point in January and until mid-February was that they needed it on the basis of law, and this led to quite a tetchy exchange between the then Prime Minister and Sir Roderick Lyons.
It was essential from the British perspective, because of our reading of the law, to have a second resolution.
No, politically, we were
not merely
saying,
preferable, but essential.
No, politically, we were saying it was going to be very hard for us. Indeed, it was going to be
but
very
weren't we
hard
saying
for
it was legally necessary for us? Because that was the advice.
What we said is that legally, it resolves that question, obviously, beyond any dispute. On the other hand, for the reasons that I've given, Peter in the end decided that actually a case could be made out for doing this without another resolution.
I mean, to be honest, I think that exchange raises more questions than it answers, but it does seem, I think Sir Roderick Lyon felt that it was odd that given that the advice at that point was that legally they did need that further resolution, then clearly that should have been the motivating factor, but Tony Blair would not acknowledge that, would not presumably be hemmed in by the lawyers, and he said no, it was purely a political motivation. Another area where I think, again, to be honest, it's rather muddied the waters, is a big question as to why Peter Goldsmith changed his the tone of his advice between the 7th and the 17th of March. He said it was because he received a letter from the Chief of the Defence Staff saying that he needed a yes-no answer to the legality. Now, some people might think that maybe Tony Blair motivated that letter, or what exactly his role in that might have been, and we just got maybe a hint of it in this very brief section.
We then had to have a definitive decision.
He said, we then had to have a definitive decision. Does that mean that he was in some way involved? To be honest, we just don't know what the process was there and why that letter was prompted. On the planning, now this is obviously one of the key areas, the post-war planning, where people feel there has been obviously very grave problems with it. But actually, there again, Tony Blair really did not give a backward step. He said that the planning was pretty much A-OK, really, apart from one assumption that they got wrong.
There was an immense amount of planning going on, but we planned with one assumption that turned out to be wrong.
And that assumption was that when they went in, they thought that the Iraqi civil service would be functioning and they would be able to build on that civil service, when in fact the whole thing had disintegrated and imploded, and they were left with having to start from the ground up. I mean, if we have time, Kay, I'm just going to nip back to, I think, one of the key areas from this morning, which was when Tony Blair was questioned about this interview that he did with Fern Britton. This is something that I think will receive a lot of interest and coverage, because at the time he said that he would have thought it right to remove Saddam Hussein, even had he known that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Listen to how he explained that.
I did not use the words regime change in that interview, and I did not in any sense mean to change the basis. It was in no sense a change of the position, and I just simply say to you, the position was that it was the breach of the United Nations resolutions on WMD. That was the cause. It was then, and it remains.
So he said it was all about WMD, but listen to what he actually did say in that BBC interview, which was broadcast last December.
I would still have thought it right to remove him. I mean, obviously you would have had to use and deploy different arguments about the nature of the threat.
So I think he is on a sticky wicket there, to be honest, because he said in that interview, I would have thought it right to remove him. It sounds like that was the key motivating factor, whereas, of course, here he was saying it was all about the fact that they were not complying with the UN on weapons of mass destruction.
And of course that's not got a legal basis in international law. Joey Fanai, thanks very much indeed. Our Foreign Affairs editor Tim Marshall is here with me.
6 hours of evidence, well, it will be by the time we're finished. It's not enough. You need about 3 days with the former Prime Minister, you would have thought, especially if they're going to waste their time on areas where we've heard from the real experts, like the Defence Secretary on planning. I think a lot of people wanted to hear much more from Mr. Blair about what he had to say to the country, what he said in the dossier, what he personally wrote in the forward to the dossier, what he said to Parliament, all those arguments which they haven't gone on at all, and also on the question of legality, which has turned out to be one of the centerpieces of the day. But they laid out for about 10 minutes, right, here's everything on legality we've heard over the past month. And I thought, right, here we go. What they're doing is laying it all out so that when Mr. Blair may try and deflect, they can say, no, we agreed. But they didn't. They simply went over a couple of questions about 1441. Mr. Blair explained his position again on why he believes it's very clear, the legality. And then they moved on. I thought, are they going to come back to this? No, they're not. And on the question of wasting time as well, Joe is quite right, Joe Jones, when he says that the Baroness has had some criticism for her questioning, and she has. And he's also right that she tried to get stuck in today. But what she did was ask her questions in an aggressive manner. But the questions themselves were not particularly aggressive. And I'll give you the best example from this afternoon when she said, "Mr. Blair, did you think about the consequences of your actions?" Well, what sort of a question is that? I mean, is he really going to say, "No, I just sort of walked into it without giving it a second thought"? I mean, it was an easy answer. Yes, we went over it in great detail. Allowing Mr. Blair another 2 or 3 minutes, which is quite a long time when you've only got 6 hours, you've lost the opportunity and off you go somewhere else.
What have we learned?
I think we've got clarity on the philosophical shift in thinking. Pre-9/11, 9/11, post-9/11, that was from this morning. We knew that anyway, but he laid his argument out very clearly. On 1441, we've learnt again that he believes in law, material breach was in the wording, that's what you needed, and therefore they went. Why was the threat growing? Because of the mobile labs. That was told, I think, to the public in early 2003, but I think today's the first time we've actually heard it. This is why it was a growing threat and we really had to get going. But this is all dancing around the central areas. Nobody has gone in hard on him and said, okay, the French were saying in private about legality what? What did they say to you? What did the Russians say to you? Why was it that these lawyers, they didn't go for the legality at all, they didn't go for the dossier, they didn't go for the arguments he made to the British public? And I think that's a wasted opportunity.
What about the demonstrators? They were very keen to see him this morning, didn't see him, unlikely to see him, just a bit of police activity now actually. Not likely to see him this afternoon.
Mr. Blair came in a car, we think with darkened windows, a couple of hours before. There was a chap out with a megaphone addressing the crowd at lunchtime, and he was saying, if we do get to see Mr. Blair, we're going to make a citizen's arrest on him. Well, I don't think they're going to get to see him. I think the roads will be closed, the black car with the darkened windows will speed out, the traffic will be shut down, and Mr. Blair will be out and away, and scot-free. And I'm not suggesting that he's got anything to hide. He has made his arguments very, very cogently today. He's set out his position about why he believed so much at the time in the intelligence that he was given, why it was the right thing to do at the time. It's just that he hasn't been pressed on those arguments, whether they're right or wrong, to the degree that I think that the protesters out here would have preferred. They would have liked a lot more rigorous questioning instead of what appeared to me, and I am one of the sort of anoraks that has followed it over the years, and I used to read 1441 for fun. So I am aware of that stuff, and so what I felt right across the day was we are simply going over and over and over stuff we've already gone over before. We're not honing in on the language, and it's all about the language.
Lots of emails reaching us here at Sky Centre, actually. skynews.com is our website address. news@sky.com 84501 if you've got a thought. If we can have a look at those protesters. David Arweni says, I think instead of demonstrating against him, they should be happy that Iraq is free from Saddam. Those in northern Kurdistan states are happy about the change. Lolly in Stockport, Blair was right on Iraq, just wished he had done the same for Zimbabwe. John Sullivan in Middlesex, hi John, Blair is right, it was a matter of judgment to go to war with Saddam, and it was his judgment to make. If his judgment was so wrong, why are hundreds and thousands of Iraqis that live in the UK not marching to condemn Blair? But not everyone agrees. There's an anonymous text here. This inquiry is ridiculous. If it was not okay for Saddam to ignore UN rules and international agreements, it was not okay for Tony Blair to ignore them either. That is what it boils down to. Two arrogant men putting themselves above all the rules. Frightening. And this one finally from Andrew in Leeds. I've been watching Blair all day. What garbage Blair comes out with. He said we had to sort out nations with WMD. So why haven't we gone into Iran? Why haven't we touched North Korea?
On Iran, the answer is very simple. There is no proof yet. There is simply the suspicion, and they're in various UN resolutions which they've got against. Actually, you know, that last email is actually very pertinent to today, because I don't think we're going to get any judgments out of this. I don't think anyone is going to be called to account. But where this is crucial about a modern democracy as it goes to war, and the things that have to happen, and the legality in going through the UN and all those things, and the planning, where it is extremely useful is that the lessons that they are going to learn, and it will come out in the report, are going to be a vital necessity to this country in the future. And I'm not, Iran is the possibility. I doubt it very much. I cannot see Britain going to war with Iran. But there may be some form of conflict with Iran that Britain will be involved with in the diplomatic area.
David Miliband was certainly very dismissive about them not attending the Afghan conference yesterday.
He was biting yesterday about the Iranians, and then Hillary Clinton was going on, and she's in Paris today talking about Iran.
Actually, she's just arrived in Northern Ireland, I believe.
Right. Iran, I'm not saying Iran is going to be like Iraq, but the point about the whole Chilcot Inquiry is that this is an opportunity for the country, the body politic, the public, the media, everybody to have this discussion about, well, why did you get that wrong? Why did you do it that way? And if it happens again, whichever country it would be, and we never know what's around the corner, no one ever thought we'd fight in Sierra Leone, no one ever thought we'd fight in Kosovo, no one ever thought we'd fight in Iraq, really. So whatever it is down the line, this inquiry, people will go back and they'll say, well, yeah, the thing you really concentrated on was this process of going through Parliament, this process of going through the United Nations. And I think that's going to turn out to be the importance of the Chilcot Inquiry, not actually a paragraph that blames the Defence Secretary for not having enough body armour, if that's what it would say.
OK, you don't think that the suggestions that regime change would have been illegal under international law, and that perhaps is one of the reasons why Mr Blair did actually go to war with Iraq, or agreed to go to war with Iraq, could be a sticking point for him?
In a different inquiry, yes. In an inquiry in an international court in The Hague, if you felt there was a case to be taken there, and the protesters do, look at the evidence and take your own view on that. But this is not what that's about. It's not about, did you do this illegally, Mr Blair, or did you do it legally? It's about the lessons learned about how we went towards war, because they're not going to come out next year and say, we judge from all the evidence that Mr Blair acted legally, or we judge from all the evidence he acted illegally. They're going to publish something about the lessons of how a nation spends the months leading up to a conflict. And that is worthwhile, but it will never satisfy the people who are on each side of the divide of the argument.
What do we say to those people who are watching, and my taxi driver who brought me today, who basically said, you know, it's costing how much today, and what will be the outcome?
Well, I refer my right honourable colleague to a previous answer. It's costing an absolute fortune, but this is part of the process that everyone's involved in. A lot of people are tuning in and watching this. You know, it has gripped the imagination.
Let's hear what he's got to say for the last section of this inquiry today.
We've heard from a number of our military witnesses that the requirements for troops to be deployed for such a sustained period in Iraq beyond the initial invasion stretch the military machine significantly beyond the limits of what the military regarded as its sustainability. Were you advised about the British military's ability to sustain a significant force in Iraq?
I was advised that we could sustain it, but it was going to be difficult, for sure. We obviously had the ongoing campaign in Afghanistan. We were bringing in troops from other countries, and I think we had about 30 countries in the coalition. I think they brought in roughly, 15 to 20,000 additional troops as well. I think we had the troops we needed in the south. But yes, it was all the way through. It was going to be difficult.
Were you concerned at any point that we had actually overcommitted ourselves?
I was very concerned to make sure we didn't, and obviously a constant interaction between myself and the military was to make sure that we didn't.
In his evidence to us, General Wall described the impact of the reduction of British forces in Iraq in the summer of 2003. And while he clearly accepted that this was necessary in order to provide for the long-term rulement of troops to sustain our troops in MND Southeast, he did make clear that this constrained his ability to contain the emerging violence in Iraq. What assumptions were made about the role of British troops with regard to Iraq once Saddam had been removed? What did you see and plan for their tasks to be?
Well, I think the idea obviously was that we would not require the same number of troops for the conflict as we would in the aftermath. There was, I think, a time in the middle of 2003 when we were asked for more troops and gave more troops. And I think our issue really in the south was less to do with the number of troops, because in fact there was relatively low-level violence in the south compared with the rest of the country. Our concern was how we managed to get the reconstruction going in the south in circumstances where fairly early on there were groups whose purpose was deliberately to stop that reconstruction.
And given the constraints, what did you see as the balance of the task of our troops, on the one hand in seeking out MND, which clearly at one point had to be a priority, and at the same time delivering a secure environment in which not only the Iraqis could sustain a normal life, but also our British civilians who were there in reconstruction?
Well, these were very much decisions for the commanders on the ground, but I think they were conscious at a very early stage of this that they were trying both to make sure that they dealt with any lingering resistance, but also that they provided security for the local people. I've gone back over this many times because I think it is very important, actually, this period straight after the invasion, because in a sense what happened was that we very quickly toppled the Saddam regime. But then what we found, as I say, was that the situation was different from the one we expected. Between, I would say, March 2003 and early 2004, during the period of time that Sir Hilary Sinnott was there, we had the situation more or less under control. There was some reconstruction going. We agreed, I think, a special claim on the reserve at the end of March 2003. What really happened was that another assumption that had been made, which was that Iran would basically not be provocative. It might have its interests, but it wasn't going to be provocative. That assumption also started to change. And what happened was that as Muqtada al-Sadr became more powerful, and obviously to an extent backed by Iran, that entered a new dimension into this. And then as 2004 went on and came into 2005, this Iranian issue became much larger.
You mentioned that it was the military who were, of course, advising in terms of the priorities, but what was your input at this time? What were you, as it were, suggesting and proposing to them?
Well, I think we were getting feedback as quickly as we could on how we could change the situation around. We were trying to get the United Nations, obviously, back in with as I call it, a vital or central role. I went out then to Iraq at the end of May 2003. I met Jerry Bremer there, and after that I had meetings both internally, commissioning work, and then had a very frank discussion with America as to what was happening up in Baghdad. And at that point, I think it's fair to say, the issue really was, I think John Sawers described this to you as the Baghdad first policy, that in the end, unless you could secure Baghdad, you were going to be in, you were always going to have difficulties. But I would say, it's interesting this, when I was getting frequent reports back, and I think as Sir Hilary Sinnott told you actually, I was always very clear with our people out there. If you've got a real problem, pick up the phone if necessary, and you start to get messed around with bureaucracy, come to me directly. I think when I saw him at the end of February 2004 when he left, he thought it was challenging, but there was some progress being made, and we had to make sure the progress carried on.
If I could go back to the military funding issue and perhaps look at its wider aspect. We've heard from several military witnesses how effectively the urgent operational requirements for the military were addressed. But we've also heard, and Jeff Hoon touched on this last week, how because of the way that the UOR process works in its years 2 and 3 of the funding cycle, the continued use of UORs over a sustained period led in effect to core MOD requirements being diverted to the ORs. Was this something that you were aware of, something that you became involved in?
I don't think this was something I was personally involved in, no. I was more involved at the level, if you like, of, say, for example, in September 2003, they asked for additional forces, and I was keen to get them going. I don't think the issues to do with urgent operational requirements really came to me.
Or the fact that the urgent operational requirements were diverting funds away under the Strategic Defence Review system.
I think if anybody had come to me and said, look, there's an issue and a problem here, and we were having ongoing discussions about the defence budget and so on and so forth within government, if someone had come to me and said, I think this is a real problem, we've got to deal with it, I would have been straight in there trying to sort it out. But I wasn't aware of that particular issue coming across my desk.
Right. In terms of other departments, we've also heard from Suma Chakrabarti, among others, of problems that essentially they felt that funding was not being devised adequately. For example, that the rehabilitation in Iraq, that the DFID requirements really required more significant resources. Is this something that came to you?
Yes, it did. And one of the reasons why we agreed a supplementary provision by the Treasury, I think of £127 million, if I remember rightly, or round about that, at the end of March was precisely because we were aware we had to ramp up pretty quickly. Now, there was an additional problem, which was getting the allocation. The Americans had made a huge allocation for the CPA, the Provisional Authority up in Baghdad, and we were trying to get that money transferred back down. And I even got involved at one point. I think I seem to remember there was a Siemens power plant, even that I got involved in trying to sort out the money being delivered for. But my basic view, I think we spent for DFID, I think 2003-04, Iraq was the key country. We spent, I think, over £260 million. I mean, it was a big commitment that we were giving. Now, much of that was humanitarian, but it was also money there for reconstruction. And had people come to me again and said, look, we need to make an even greater commitment, I would have done so. But I think, to be fair, during that period of time, as people were then assessing a quite different situation, what became clear in time was not a lack of resource, but a lack of security.
Well, that brings me to my final question, really, and you touched, I think, just before the break, in part on your answer, and that is the question of anticipating some of these problems in advance. I mean, from what we've heard from the people on the ground, the military, and also, of course, the DFID, and the whole question of the deteriorating security situation, are these not things which in August, September, October 2002 should have been addressed? After all, Iraq was not an unknown quantity.
Absolutely correct. And we focused very much on what we would find and how we would deal with it. And also, there was, of course, I mean, I raised this issue myself several times. How would the Sunni-Shia relationship work out? And that was going to be a major part of the problem. You had basically three groups. You had the Kurds up in the north, you had the Sunni, and then down the south it was predominantly Shia. For that very reason, there was another reason why I wanted the UN closely involved, because I thought they had a better chance of bringing those groups together. It was also a reason why very early on we put a lot of effort into getting a sense amongst the different Iraqi groups that they could come together, because one of the things that happened in Iraq, obviously, is that the Sunni, who were, 20% of the population, had effectively ruled the country. And so the majority Shia population had been excluded. So this was going to be a huge thing now. They were, for the first time, going to come into positions of power. But we put a lot of focus and work on that. And by and large, one of the extraordinary things about this, from 2003 onwards, is this political process, despite everything, continued. And actually, it was in 2006, as the result of what was a absolutely wicked and deliberate act of bombing the Samarra Mosque, that was what then started to tip this into a Shia-Sunni issue. Now, fortunately, in the end, we got back out of it again. But in 2004, down in the south, there were all sorts of issues, but we were managing them.
But was it then a weakness in the pre-March 2003 discussions that that somehow voices weren't raised and experts and knowledge wasn't put on the table, that there could be this massive deterioration?
Well, there was very much discussion of the Shia-Sunni issue, and we were very, very well aware of that. What there wasn't, and this again is of vital importance, and this certainly is a lesson in any situation similar to this, people did not believe that you would have Al-Qaeda coming in from outside, and people did not believe that you would end up in a situation where Iran, once, as it were, the threat of Saddam was removed from them, would then try to deliberately to destabilize the country. But that's what they did. And there are some very important lessons in that, because what is important also to understand, throughout this process, the Iraqi people as a people were not in favor of the violence. They were not in favor of sectarianism. As a people, they supported and have supported throughout the political process. Indeed, today in Iraq, you've now got, for the elections that are coming up, groups who are overtly non-sectarian standing for election, which is a huge thing for the whole of the Middle East, and a great thing, incidentally. So I think in future you have to be aware of is that if you're dealing with a country where you're likely to get this, as I say, this perversion of the proper faith of Islam as a major element in the equation, you are going to have to prepare for that very carefully. Your troop configuration's got to be prepared for it, and you're going to have to be prepared for quite a fight over it.
But this wasn't something, for example, you mentioned, I think, twice in your speeches before the war, your meeting with Iraqis and how affected you were by that. But they weren't giving this sort of warning sign?
No, they weren't. I mean, they look, it was a statement of the obvious. I mean, Britain, in a sense, as Iraqis remember, back in the 1920s, were intimately involved with all this. So everybody understood the history of how Iraq had come about. And obviously you had the Kurds, you had the Sunni, you had the Shia. But the consensus view was you had to watch for this Sunni-Shia violence. That was precisely why you had to construct an inclusive political process. Right from the outset, we tried to deal with that. And I did something else, and I think Jack Straw mentioned this to you in his evidence. I also sent Jack to talk to the Iranians. I mean, a very big lesson of this for me was that we tried with the Iranians, tried very hard to reach out, to, in a sense, make an agreement with them, to give them a strong indication that it wasn't the American forces were not there, having done Iraq, to move through to Iran or any of the rest of it. And one of the most disappointing, but also I think most telling aspects of this is that the Iranians, whatever they said, from the beginning, were a major destabilizing factor in this situation, and quite deliberately.
Thank you.
I think, Roderick, you've got
Can I just briefly follow through on that point and then just raise one other? Hindsight's a wonderful thing, and with all the wisdom of hindsight, I suppose it seems pretty obvious now that Al-Qaeda would seek to exploit conflict in Iraq, and indeed that the Iranians would as well. And as you've just said, they had a destabilizing effect, and they must have enjoyed putting pressure on us and the Americans at a time when we were trying to put them under pressure to deal with their nuclear program. Now, that's all hindsight. But if there'd been a really rigorous risk assessment made before we went in, would it really not have shown that these risks existed? You've repeatedly referred to how these external factors destabilized and how this wasn't something that had been predicted. Could it and should it have been predicted?
Well, that is a very, very good question. Let me try and answer it. We did ask for an assessment on Iran, particularly. Indeed, you will see through the intelligence assessments in 2002, I am constantly going back and forward. You know, is Iran, and I think I asked this again in February 2003, what's the attitude of Iran going to be? The conventional wisdom, if you like, at the time, was that you might get elements of the Revolutionary Guard playing about, but basically the evidence was that Iran would more or less have a watching brief to see how it would play out, but it had no interest in destabilizing.
Despite the fact that Iraq had fought a long war with it, they weren't exactly best pals.
No, exactly, but that was the point, that because, as it were, Saddam had been their enemy in the Iran-Iraq war, and heaven knows, I mean, I think, as I say, there were 1 million casualties of that war. It was the most terrible situation, precisely because they would be pleased to get rid of Saddam. We thought they would be more amenable. I had actually spoken myself to the president of Iran prior to September the 11th, when we were trying to get the new resolution on sanctions. I'd actually had a telephone conversation with President Khatami at the time, and basically had gone out of my way to say, look, let's have a new relationship and so on. So in respect of Iran, that was the advice, but we did go into this in some detail. In respect of Al-Qaeda, and I think in retrospect, this was difficult. At the time, and you know, we know so much more about these groups and how they operate now, but at the time, the single thing people were most determined to prove was, in a sense, they were two separate problems. Because the Americans had raised this question of a link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, and really our system in Britain was determined to say, no, come on, keep the two things separate. We're not saying Saddam had anything to do with September the 11th, and that was very much how Al-Qaeda was seen. Now, I think, and this is a very interesting point, because it absolutely goes to the 2010 point that I raised earlier. My view is if we'd left Saddam there, and he'd carried on, as we said, with the intent to develop these weapons and the know-how and the concealment program, and the sanctions had gone, I have little doubt myself, but it's a judgment and other people may take a different judgment, that today we would be facing a situation where Iraq was competing with Iran, competing both on nuclear weapons capability and competing, more important perhaps than anything else, competing as well as the nuclear issue in respect of support of terrorist groups.
I think it would be very useful, if we have time at the end, to come back to this 2010 point, because you've raised something that other witnesses have not so far raised with us, at least not in that way. But you've raised it as a sort of binary question, whereas there are alternative scenarios under which Saddam might very well still be in a box. I mean, it wasn't a question of whether he got right out of it or not, but I think it's best if we don't go down the track at this moment. I just wanted to put one other question about the post-conflict period to you, which is simply this. You said you went to Baghdad in May and you met Bremer. And of course, when Bremer arrived, he arrived setting up the CPA in place of Orha, which everybody had described as a shambles, with two extremely important edicts that he promulgated in his first week, which had been pre-packaged in Washington, on de-Baathification and on the disbandment of the Iraqi armed forces. Now, it wasn't, as other witnesses have told us, that we disagreed with the principle of these edicts. It was really the extent. They were far too sweeping, and that damage had to be undone. So a lot of damage, it turned out, was done by these edicts, I mean, again, based on what we've heard in evidence. My question is this, simply, had we been consulted before this happened by Washington on these very important decisions, we were their co-occupying power, and if they hadn't consulted us, should they have done?
Well, certainly the moment, I mean, I don't know whether there had been any official contact on this at all. I know I hadn't had the discussion with the White House on it. I would, however, say the moment we were aware of this, John Sawyers was, of course, in Baghdad then, and he was onto the case. I think one of the things you know that obviously you will do is to look at this de-Baathification and disbanding of the army and assess how big a factor it was.
We have done to an extent already.
I would say it's quite interesting. This, I mean, I am not sure in my own mind about this even now. I think in respect of de-Baathification, and I think John Sawyers said this to you, it was going to be really difficult to prevent a certain level of de-Baathification. The question is, should it have gone down to the level that it did?
Point. Yeah.
Now, all I would say about that was that the pressure, because it's almost impossible for us, I think, to understand how oppressed and repressed the population of Iraq felt. Suddenly they had this freedom. They detested these Ba'athist people. I mean, I remember meeting groups of Iraqis before the invasion, and they would tell you of the torture chambers and all the rest. Now, I know we had the same problem with the Nazi Party in Germany after the war. It's a very, very difficult situation, this. And even now, because I got on to President Bush pretty much straight away on this, and I think...
But it was kind of too late by then. So, effectively, we hadn't been consulted in advance. As soon as we heard about it, you and John Sawyers got onto it.
Yes, I think John was actually there at the time of decision.
And my other question was, do you feel we should have been consulted about it before
Well, I feel
decided?
It's a decision of such moment that it would have been sensible if there had been a major discussion about it.
So the answer is yes?
Yeah, but I would say to you that, to be fair to the Americans, the moment that it happened, we raised these issues with them, and actually they reacted to it.
But they didn't withdraw the decisions?
Well, they amended the decisions very substantially. And this is where I think, again, I would consult quite carefully with the people who took these decisions in the American side, because I've spoken to people subsequent to this. I think probably it's true it would have been better not to have done the de-Baathification and disbanding of the army in that way. But all I say to you is that's a very live debate amongst the people that were there at the time.
Thank you.
And just to say this, as a result of the conversation I had with George Bush literally days after this, they were then scaling back. They scaled back further. And in respect of the army, they were always intending to re-recruit, and then they corrected this pension problem that they had with the army, you know, pretty quickly. So all I would say is I think it's something that you need to take a range of views on.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Thank you. And we're now firmly, obviously, into the post-war period. We've discussed before lunch some hours ago the ISG report, and I really don't want to go back over that. I think we can agree it indicated that Saddam had never lost his interest in WMD programs. But the headline for most people was that the actual stocks of WMD, the reconstituted facilities as discussed in the dossier, for example, had not been found. What was when did you realise that that was likely to be the case?
Well, obviously, as time went on through the course of 2003, you know, at the very beginning, and you know, I hope this has taken as some evidence of our genuine belief about this. At the very beginning, we were constantly, almost daily, getting reports that there was this site or that site, and we were trying to direct the armed forces there. It was a major part of our operation, actually, after the 19th of March. But obviously, during the course of 2004, it became very difficult to sustain this.
Well, I mean, General Fry has told us that even as those troops were on that mission, as you described, they became somewhat disillusioned because the places that it was supposed to be there, it wasn't there. So even during the course of 2003. Now, that's the fact that you now found. We've gone into this campaign on one assumption. Maybe as things have developed in the future, it still could have turned out as badly as you thought it already was. But it meant that, in effect, that the quality of post-Saddam Iraq was now going to be the major test of what we were doing. I just want to briefly go back before the war. Were you aware of the pre-war assessment that the American Army, the Chief of the American Army, General Shinesky, made, that 500,000 troops were going to be needed to secure Iraq? And it wasn't just him that was saying this. He was slapped down by Paul Wolfowitz for the comment. Were you aware of that?
I was aware there was always a debate within the American system. Did you use I think it was the doctrine of overwhelming force, or did you have a smaller group of people, a smaller force? And I think the issue is really for the post-war period. I mean, I think you can argue for the actual conflict itself, there were sufficient troops. The question is, should you then have changed and had more or different troops later? Now, I think, again, that is a difficult question to answer, and there are people who take both sides of that.
Indeed. The part of the debate within the United States was the determination of Donald Rumsfeld to demonstrate that it was possible to wage a campaign of this sort with comparatively few forces, meant that he underprovided for the security situation that was going to arrive after the war, which was General Shinesky's point. And so in some senses, the difficulties that were going to be faced were predetermined. It was always going to be difficult after the war. There just weren't enough troops around.
Yeah, I think the key thing is this, and again, this is a major, major part of how any such operation would be done in the future. The force to remove a regime and change the government, if that's what happens, that's the only way you can secure your objectives, and this is the decision we'd come to. The only way we could prevent Saddam being a threat was actually to remove him from office. The force that you require to do that is one function, and there are one set of arguments that go along that. And you're probably much more expert in this than me. However, what we now know, and in any of these situations should know from now on, is that you will be nation building after that. And that may require a quite different type of force, and it may require more, it may require simply different forces, but it's a different task.
And indeed, they are different requirements. We've had evidence about the skill of British forces in being able to move quite quickly from a war-fighting role to this nation-building role. But it's fair to say, and I don't think and Americans certainly now would disagree with this, that was not the way that they looked at it. That from Rumsfeld's point of view, it was the war-fighting role he was interested in, and they'd made very little provision, both in training, doctrine, and numbers, for the follow-on forces that would provide for the security. So in the context also of the disbandment of the Iraqi army, the risk of a vacuum in the security situation is very high indeed.
Well, I think in respect to the disbanding of the army, I think, again, I think it was Mr. Slocum who was dealing with this on behalf of the Americans, and I think his view was that, in a sense, the army melted away and then they tried to re-recruit.
It was the pensions point you mentioned.
And the pensions point, which is also
earlier. It was true that they it didn't exist as an organised force, but there was a basis to get them back together quickly again, which was lost.
Right. I think a huge question here, because security was what went wrong. I mean, sometimes people say, well, you'd done the reconstruction quicker or got more underway or something, would have been a different situation. My view of this is that the very purpose of the people we ended up fighting was to stop the reconstruction. So every time we'd repair electricity, they'd bomb it. Every time you got the oil production going, they'd try and sabotage it. Every time you tried to provide better facilities, they'd try and wreck it. So the issue is a security issue. Now, I think we've moved beyond what was a debate at the time, which really went something like this. And you probably recall this from 2003 and the early part of 2004. And that was a debate which said, look, the Americans are good at doing war fighting, but they don't do peacekeeping. The British can do both. I think if we are looking at our own capabilities now and what we will do in the future, I think it's not as simple as that, actually. And if you look at what General Petraeus did in the end with the surge, it is correct that he had his political dimension, reaching out to the Sunnis and so on, But as the surge began, the American forces suffered even heavier casualties. I mean, they were doing fighting.
Yes.
And one of the things that I think, I'm afraid we have to learn from this situation, because we face exactly the same situation in Afghanistan, is that in these circumstances, it's not going to be easy. You know, you don't move to peacekeeping because actually you're facing a situation where your enemy is trying to kill you.
And it partly depends upon your ability to assert order and authority early on. And we don't need to go into all the details, but that's clearly where things went badly wrong, and we can remember the looting and so on, and comments that were made at the time. Let me fast forward to what seems to me a particularly significant month, which is April 2004. A lot of things happened in that month. One of them was Spain left the coalition, but we'll leave that to one side. Fallujah. You have relations with the Sunni community had deteriorated. They felt they were potentially being disenfranchised. This was coming to a head in Fallujah, where US Marines were planning to enter the city with force to take out some 2,000, I think, insurgents. How did you view that situation? Because it was potentially extremely dangerous.
It certainly was, yes. And I was involved in discussions with the Americans, with the president, and also with Alawi as well, who was taking on the interim administration in Iraq. I mean, I think at the time, I was worried the Americans were going in too hard and too heavy. And they made certain changes as a result of the conversations that we were having. If I look back at it now, I'm not sure I was right about it, though. You see, I think the truth is we were...
The event, this did happen. Did we actually rethink? Did we actually stop and reevaluate our strategy at that stage?
We would have entirely reevaluated our strategy had, as I say, and I'm just using this as a shorthand, Saddam Hussein done a Gaddafi. But he said, I'm finished with all this. I want to join the international community on proper terms. But he didn't. And what he did, and this is where, as I say, the Iraq Survey Group, unfortunately, people have only looked at one part of their findings and not the other part of their findings. He never had any intention of complying because he had the intention, once he got sanctions out of the way, of restarting it again.
But even later, it became clear that our post-war efforts were becoming strategic failure. I mean, did we think at that stage? Because, you know, the impression one gets is we're responding to events on the ground. Were we doing any rethinking?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason why we were in a constant iteration very quickly after the conflict was because of what we were finding. And then, as I say, there was this metamorphosis of the whole struggle, really, and battle, when, you know, the AQ and Iran elements became uppermost, and then it really did change into a different type of fight. And one of the interesting things, for example, I think Kimberly Kagan does this in her book on the surge, and it's important because, in the end, that is what worked. What nobody foresaw was that Iran would actually end up, in fact, supporting AQ. I mean, everyone, the conventional wisdom was these two are completely different types of people, because Iran is Shia, the Al-Qaeda people are Sunni, and therefore, you know, the two would never mix. What happened in the end was that they did, because they both had a common interest in destabilizing the country. And for Iran, I think the reason they were interested in destabilizing Iraq was because they worried about having a functioning majority Shia country with a democracy on their doorstep. And for Al-Qaeda, they knew perfectly well their whole mission was to try and say the West was oppressing Islam. It's hard to do that if you replace tyrannical governments with functioning democracies.
So from your point of view, you think the machinery of government worked?
Well, I can't think, I don't doubt you could have different machineries, but we did have a machinery of government that worked and worked effectively in order to analyse the problems we were likely to face and how we would deal with them. And as I say, I think no doubt there are other ways that it can be done. But we
and on reflection, there's nothing you would do differently.
Look, I think when you look back now, and I've just said to you earlier, for example, if you want to look at maybe putting a specific cabinet minister in charge of this, there are all sorts of things that if you knew then what you know now, you would do differently. I've been through the whole reconstruction piece. But in terms of what we knew at that time, we had a machinery of government that was perfectly adequate for it. There were, as I say, 25 separate cabinet meetings, 24 ad hoc or 28 ad hoc committee meetings, regular weekly meetings of the officials. Now, you could put them with a capital A and